Hey guys, tonight we begin with something so ordinary you probably touched it today. Bread. But we're not just nibbling on a crust here. We're about to chew our way through 10,000 years of history, one floury disaster at a time. Imagine biting into a biscuit made of sand, ash, and regret. That's how bread started. It was tough, it was gritty, it may have included small pebbles, and no, you probably wouldn't survive the Neolithic version of a dinner roll. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Post your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where you're tuning in from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Wow. Long before anyone was slicing anything or slapping butter on toast, people were just gnawing on seeds. It wasn't glamorous. In fact, it was mostly survival. The very first bread wasn't bread at all. It was a sad little mash of wild grains, chewed into a pulp and maybe dried in the sun if someone felt fancy. Think granola bar, if the bar was soggy and the granola tried to stab you. We're talking way back, over 30,000 years ago, back when Homo sapiens were still trying to figure out which plants wouldn't kill them. On flat rocks across the Levant and Central Europe, archaeologists have found grinding stones dusted with traces of ancient starch, which means someone was already experimenting with grass seeds and roots, crushing them down into something resembling flour. It was probably eaten raw or baked in the embers. And no, it didn't taste like a croissant, more like crunchy desperation. But that moment, grinding grain, was the beginning of everything. It meant humans were starting to invest energy into transforming raw food, not just hunting or gathering it. Cooking gave more calories. Grinding helped digestion. Suddenly, chewing was optional. Sort of. The first actual flour wasn't soft or white or lovely. It was coarse, lumpy, and full of things you didn't want near your teeth. Early grinders used basalt or sandstone, which meant the flour came with bonus rock dust. This wasn't a bug, it was a feature. If you were lucky, you got iron. If you weren't, you got dental decay in your 20s and died in your 30s. That's why so many ancient skeletons have sandpapered molars. Bread, quite literally, chewed you back, and the ingredients weren't any better. The grains used, wild einkorn, emmer, or other primitive ancestors of wheat, mixed with whatever else looked vaguely edible, acorns, cattail roots, maybe even leftover pine nuts. If it grew, it probably got crushed and tried. Historians still argue whether these early mixtures count as bread, or if they were more like proto-porridges. The line is blurred. So was the taste. And the method? Well, picture this. Someone grinding seeds between stones until their arms are jelly. Then comes water. Because you need a paste. Not a dough, not yet. Just a goopy mess. Then a flat rock heated in fire. Slap the paste on it. Wait. Hope it holds shape. The result, a scorched hard disk of calories. Possibly still crunchy from leftover husks. Definitely dry enough to double as a throwing weapon. Delicious. Still, it was revolutionary, because it was food you could carry. Dry it, stack it, maybe chew it again. 3 days later. It was portable, shareable, and durable. No other food had that combo. Not meat, not fruit. Bread, the ugliest version of it, made its mark. And so did the tools. Mortars and pestles, querns and grinders. They all became part of early households, which also meant flour making was time-consuming, often delegated to women, and considered a chore. Congratulations, you invented bread and unpaid labor. It didn't stop there. Eventually, clever cave dwellers probably noticed that their soggy paste puffed up slightly if left out overnight. Rainwater, wild yeasts, bacteria, who knows? But that puff small, accidental fermentation was the quiet beginning of leavened bread. It took thousands more years to perfect, but the seed was planted, literally and figuratively. By the time humans settled into agriculture, around 10,000 years ago, grains became staples. Einkorn and emmer were cultivated in the Fertile Crescent, the stretch of fertile land from modern-day Iraq to Egypt. With farming came routine, and with routine came planning. Grains were stored, mills were built. Baking became a thing. The weirdest part, no one planned for bread to be good. It was supposed to be stable, nutritious-ish, chewable, but somewhere between chewing on reeds and burning their fingertips on hot stones, humans grew attached to it. They added herbs, ash, animal fat, bugs, accidentally. Flavor happened by accident. And so did community. If you're baking together, you're living together, you're surviving together. And yes, even then there were failures. Charred loaves, undercooked goo, ash-coated lumps mistaken for dung, or vice versa. Mistakes were made, possibly eaten, definitely not repeated. Even more charming, some early societies started offering their terrible bread to the gods, maybe to say thanks, maybe to get rid of it. Either way, bread became sacred, not for its taste, but for what it meant. Energy, effort, survival, transformation. You take tiny bitter seeds, grind them, burn them, and somehow get life. But if you think things were about to get tastier, think again. You haven't even met the ancient Egyptians yet. So here you are, squatting in a patch of Neolithic mud, somewhere between modern-day Turkey and a future kebab stand, poking at a sticky, beige lump with a stick. It's early farming days now, and you, yes, lucky you, have just discovered that when you mix water with ground-up wheat berries, you get this gloopy, mysterious stuff that dries out into something vaguely edible. Congratulations, you've invented dough. Sort of. You're still missing a rolling pin, a recipe, and anything resembling hygiene. But it's a start. Farming had finally taken root in the Fertile Crescent, and with it came a revolution. People stopped chasing their food and started growing it. And that, naturally, meant more time to get bored and get experimental. Bread, or at least its prehistoric shadow, suddenly became a group activity. You weren't just mashing seeds and grunting at birds anymore. You were kneading. You were sharing. You were waiting around for things to cook. That's civilization right there. Except baking might be too generous a word. These early proto-loaves weren't slotted into wood-fired ovens. There were no golden crusts. Instead, dough was either slapped onto hot rocks or buried under the coals of an open fire. Think flatbread meets charcoal briquette. A lot of it burned, a lot of it stuck. But every so often, someone got it just right. A smoky little puck of warm starch, firm on the outside, chewy on the inside, and surprisingly filling. That little breakthrough, it changed everything. Because now, food didn't have to be eaten instantly. You could carry it, trade it, save it, store it. And once grain was harvested in bulk, suddenly, it wasn't just dinner. It was currency, status, culture. You could survive winter, travel farther, feed more mouths, all with a handful of flour and a fire, which made bread kind of a miracle. A dry, slightly sandy miracle. But let's not romanticize it too much. You still had to grind everything by hand, which was basically CrossFit with worse snacks. Quernstones weighed as much as a medium-sized dog, and even with all that effort, your bread might still turn out chewy in the middle and scorched on the edges. And if you dropped it, too bad. 5-second rule hadn't been invented yet. Also, the floor was actual dirt, and yet, people kept doing it. Why? Because weirdly, it was worth it. Especially when someone figured out that adding certain herbs or ash to the dough made it taste less like despair. That's right, seasoning was born. And with it, the earliest culinary opinions: too bitter, not enough bark, needs more deer fat. The first food critics were probably just very tired people with aching jaws and strong opinions. Even more fascinating, early breads started to take on symbolic meaning. There are hints that some loaves were shaped differently for rituals: round for the sun, triangular for fertility, maybe shaped like animals or people for reasons no one wrote down. Historians still argue whether these were actual offerings, or just some bored teenager getting creative. Either way, bread became more than food. It became expression. And yes, the first bakers may have been women. In fact, many archaeologists believe women were the primary food processors in early farming societies, grinding flour and baking as part of their daily routine. So if you're picturing a Neolithic village, imagine rows of hunched figures pounding grain at dawn, while kids screamed and dogs stole the scraps. It was domesticity before IKEA. mess before measuring cups. Here's the really odd part. Once leavening happened, again probably by accident, it was game over. Someone left dough out too long. Bacteria and wild yeast got involved. And voila, puffed up bread. It didn't rise like supermarket loaves today, of course. It was more like a bubbly lump, but it was softer, easier to chew, and way more satisfying. It also meant waiting hours instead of minutes, which led to, ta-da, downtime. Possibly the birth of leisure, or naps. Definitely nap. Also, this meant bread started to take on textures. Some came out fluffy-ish, some flat as stone, others sour or smoky or crispy on the edges. And people began noticing the difference. A good loaf? That was a treat. A bad one? That was fuel or punishment. Sometimes both. And then came the shared ovens. Not fancy domes, just holes in the ground lined with clay, maybe topped with hot coals or slabs of rock. Everyone took turns baking. Everyone had opinions. Everyone had burns on their fingers. But this is where the communal act of bread really began. You weren't just feeding yourself, you were joining a system. And with systems came rules. Who gets to bake first? Whose grain is best? What if someone burns the loaf? Suddenly, bread wasn't just dinner, it was politics. A loaf could mean cooperation, or theft, or that awkward moment when you realize someone's loaf looks suspiciously like your loaf, but with added wild berries. Meanwhile, in other parts of the world, China, the Americas, Sub-Saharan Africa, other grains were being mashed and baked in similar ways. But here, in the Fertile Crescent, wheat was becoming royalty, because wheat had gluten, and gluten, that stretchy, bouncy, chewy protein magic, made everything better, or at least stickier. Other grains, like millet or barley, couldn't match it. So wheat won, which is funny because most early wheat had to be dehulled by hand and was a nightmare to harvest. But humans are stubborn and slightly masochistic when food is involved. The results? Early societies began worshipping bread, literally, offerings to gods, ritual meals, burials, with loaves. Bread became sacred, not because it was delicious, but because it was earned. Every bite was labor, every crumb was time, and every loaf told a story. You've come a long way from chewed-up seed paste, and things are about to get fancier, because next Egypt enters the chat. You know that warm golden loaf you pull out of the oven, the kind that makes your whole house smell like comfort and childhood and toast. Ancient Mesopotamians didn't have that, but they tried. Oh, they tried hard. And what they built wasn't just bread, it was an empire of crumbs. Mesopotamia, the land between rivers, was hot, dry, and full of ambition. By around 3000 BCE, cities like Uruk and Babylon had blossomed into sprawling centers of trade, politics, and very enthusiastic baking. Wheat and barley grew in the river-fed fields, and temples controlled the grain, literally. Priests managed granaries, hired bakers, and distributed loaves. You didn't just pray for your daily bread, you got it from the god's bakery. And we're not talking about a loaf here or there. Some temples had hundreds of bakers. The bread wasn't just for eating, it was for offerings, wages, feasts, taxes, soldiers, even the dead. There was a bread-based bureaucracy. It was Excel spreadsheets with crumbs, the types, endless. Ancient Sumerians had over 300 different words for types of bread, some flat, some puffed, some shaped like animals or twisted into spirals, some baked with dates, sesame seeds, or honey. Others were stuffed, steamed, or fried in fat. There were breads for breakfast, for sacrifices, for mourning, for partying. If you were important enough, your bread might even come with beer, and if you were really important, you could eat both and still call yourself a priest. The standard unit was a kind of barley ration, used as currency. Workers were literally paid in loaves and beer. Imagine clocking out of your 12-hour mud brick shift and getting a soggy flatbread and a warm pint of cloudy ale. Payroll was a lunchbox. But here's the kicker. Mesopotamian bakers were already getting scientific. Clay tablets describe different methods, proportions, and tools. Historians still argue whether these were actual recipes or just inventory notes. But it's clear, bread making was a technical skill. One bad batch could offend the gods, or cause a labor riot. The pressure was real. They had ovens too, not just hot rocks anymore. Dome-shaped clay ovens called tenors appeared in homes and workshops, heated with wood or dung. You slapped the dough onto the inner wall, waited for it to bubble and brown, then peeled it off with a stick or your singed fingers. Bonus points if you didn't lose your eyebrows. This is where bread started to taste. Intentional. The crust crisped. The center stayed soft. You could dip it in oil or sauce, or share it around a table, or offer it to the gods and hope they didn't notice you burned the edges. One fringe tidbit. Some breads were shaped into little human or animal figures, possibly used in rituals or offerings, but also possibly eaten as a joke. Historians don't agree. Was it sacred? Was it satire? Did someone just really want to bite the head off a dough lamb? No one knows. Also, mold. If you've ever left your sourdough starter too long, imagine that in a mud brick bakery without refrigeration. Some Mesopotamian breads were intentionally fermented, others accidentally so. Some may have developed natural yeast from the air. Others were helped along by beer foam, which carries live yeast. And yes, that's right, your starter dough might have been recycled from someone's leftover ale sludge. It gets better. Some regions baked twice fermented loaves, rising over several days, similar to modern sourdough. This wasn't just to make it fluffy, it preserved better. And considering Mesopotamian summer heat could melt clay, preserving anything was a miracle. There were even baking laws. City officials tracked grain supplies and rationed loaves during shortages. Some bakers were contracted by the state. Others worked in private shops, selling to households. If your bread weighed less than it was supposed to, you could get fined or worse. A short loaf was a political statement. Bread fraud was not taken lightly. Still, bread was the equalizer. Everyone ate it, rich or poor, priest or bricklayer. Maybe different quality, maybe different ingredients, but no one skipped bread. Even prisoners got a loaf. Even the dead were buried with some. And here's a fun, bizarre fact. Some ancient tablets depict loaves shaped like turtles, birds, or miniature pyramids. No one's sure if these were eaten, offered, or just looked cute, but clearly Mesopotamian bakers had opinions, and time, and dough. It's also here that bread became associated with identity. Certain cities were known for certain styles, crispy crusts, soft centers, added figs, or sesame toppings. Bread was regional and political, a bit like bagels in New York or baguettes in Paris, but way sweatier and with more goats nearby. Let's also pause to admire the first bread emojis. Cuneiform signs for loaves, bakeries, flour, and grain, all baked into clay tablets. Imagine writing a love letter in symbols, casually slipping in a pictogram of small round barley bun. Flirtation, 2000 BCE style. But life wasn't all warm loaves and barley beer. Famine came often, crops failed, and when that happened, bread became bitter. Literally. Some loaves were stretched with sawdust, clay, or dried weeds. Anything to fill the belly. Even the gods probably frowned at that. Still, it's here, among the reeds and reeds of Sumer, that bread stopped being just survival. It became a system. It had categories, ceremonies, artistry, jobs, joy. Bread was part of daily rhythm. It kept cities moving. And when those cities collapsed, their bread legacy didn't die. It simply drifted downriver, toward the land of lotus flowers and sacred cats. Egypt was next. And Egypt loved bread. So you've followed the crumbs from the muddy fields of Mesopotamia down the Nile, where things are warmer, wetter, and way more organized. Welcome to ancient Egypt, where bread wasn't just a staple. It was practically a religion. Let's be clear, Egyptians took bread seriously. They baked it, taxed it, offered it to gods, stuffed it in tombs, and paid their workers with it. If you were building a pyramid, you were probably doing it on a diet of bread, onions, and beer, which sounds more like a college meal plan than a royal payroll, but somehow it worked. The bread itself? Impressive in variety. Archaeologists have found actual loaves preserved in tombs, some still intact after 3,000 years. That's how dense they were. Dense and, in many cases, dangerously chewy. Most were made from emmer wheat, a grain that had to be threshed and hulled like a particularly uncooperative pine cone. It was gritty, fibrous, and full of minerals. Unfortunately, it also ground down teeth faster than a bag of gravel. See, Egyptian flour wasn't just flour. It was a cocktail of crushed grain, stone dust from the grinding stones, and whatever happened to blow in from the desert. You ate it anyway. What choice did you have? Dental records from ancient mummies show severe tooth erosion. People literally wore their teeth down to the gums just by eating their daily loaf. It was nutritious-ish, but it was not gentle. Still, that didn't stop Egyptians from baking a lot. Some loaves were shaped like cones, others like rings or animals. Some were leavened, some flat, some sweetened with dates or honey, and some were experimental to the point of alarming. There's evidence that sourdough, think prehistoric sourdough starter, was used to give certain breads a puffier texture. Others may have been steamed inside clay molds, and a few contained things like sycamore fig pulp or bits of herbs, maybe even beer dregs. You had to keep it interesting when your diet was 70% carbs. In fact, Egypt may have been one of the first cultures to standardize baking at scale. Bakeries were attached to temples, palaces, and even military outposts. Some were enormous. In Thebes, excavated remains show rows of conical ovens, each capable of baking dozens of loaves at a time. These weren't hobbyists, they were logistical bread professionals. One mainstream historical fact: the workers who built the pyramids weren't slaves, they were paid laborers, and they received rations of bread and beer as wages. Huge, state-run granaries managed the grain supply, and bakeries pumped out thousands of loaves a day. This wasn't just food, it was payroll, healthcare, and morale. But here's the thing, not all bread was created equal. The rich got finer, whiter loaves, less grit, more flavor. The poor got darker, rougher bread, stretched with barley or legumes. And yes, you could taste the difference. Bread became a symbol of status. The more refined your loaf, the more refined you were. It was early social stratification, baked fresh every morning. There's also evidence that bread was used in rituals and offerings. Loaves were placed in tombs for the dead to enjoy in the afterlife. Some were molded into the shapes of gods, or used in ceremonies that honored fertility and the harvest. Bread was life. Literally, it was called life-giver in hieroglyph. The symbol for bread, a little semicircle, shows up constantly in inscriptions, names, and prayers. Even the word for offering was closely tied to bread. You didn't show devotion with gold, you did it with a loaf. And if you really wanted to show respect, you gave bread with beer. The two were practically married. Fermented grain drink plus fermented grain loaf. A symphony of barley. Here's a fringe tidbit. Egyptian sourdough may have developed when bakers left dough out too long in the hot, humid air, accidentally cultivating wild yeast and lactobacilli. The result? A tangy, bubbly dough that puffed up better than anything seen in Mesopotamia. Some researchers think this was the beginning of true leavened bread. Others say it was still too inconsistent to count. Historians still argue whether Egypt invented real rising bread, or just got really good at faking it with trapped steam and optimism. But not all Egyptian bread was for eating. Some was made just for show. Beautifully shaped loaves intended as temple offerings or tomb decorations. These loaves were sometimes painted, sometimes hollow. Think edible art. Except no one ever took a bite. It was food as symbolism, devotion kneaded into dough. And still, regular folk had their daily crust to think about. Village ovens were common. So was shared baking space. Families ground their own grain, mixed the dough, and baked it communally. This meant you knew exactly who burned their loaf, whose bread always exploded, and who snuck raisins into everything. It was social life, pre-cafe. The grain economy was everything. Pharaohs stored surplus in massive granaries, guarded like treasure, and in times of drought or famine, bread was wealth. It could be traded, hoarded, stolen, or taxed. Entire uprisings were sparked when grain prices rose or rations were cut. Bread riots weren't modern, they were ancient. Even education got in on the act. Scribes in training practiced writing with lists of bread types and grain measurements. If you were literate, you probably started with the Egyptian version of a grocery list. But the bread wasn't perfect. No matter how sacred or systematic it became, it was still packed with grit, prone to mold, and wildly inconsistent, depending on season, weather, and available labor. Sometimes it turned out soft and nourishing. Other times, it could break a tooth or attract flies, but it remained essential, because in Egypt, bread wasn't just baked, it was believed in, and that belief would echo far beyond the Nile. So Egypt had the grain, the ovens, the mass production, the rituals, but now things start to rise, literally, because this is the part of history where someone, maybe out of sheer laziness, maybe divine accident, left dough sitting around in a hot kitchen long enough for yeast to throw a party. And from that funky little miracle came leavened bread. Picture it, a clay bowl, some leftover dough, a hot and humid day, and boom, bubbles. Not from boiling or baking, but from air trapped inside. The dough inflates like it's got something to say. Someone pokes it, suspicious. Then they bake it anyway, and when it comes out, it's fluffier, not just flatbread anymore. It's alive. And sure, it probably smelled a bit like feet, but it tasted better than any other loaf they'd made that month. Historians still argue whether leavening first occurred in Egypt or somewhere else entirely. Maybe it drifted in from the Levant or Anatolia. But Egypt definitely made it iconic. They embraced it. They scaled it. They turned accidental fermentation into standard practice. And in doing so, reshaped the future of bread. How did they do it? Well, yeast is everywhere. In the air, on the grain, even on your hands. If you mix flour and water and leave it long enough, the yeast finds its way in. Add warmth and time, and you get gas. The Egyptians learned to save a lump of dough from one batch to seed the next, a starter in modern terms. It's ancient sourdough, with a slightly higher chance of food poisoning. Some starter cultures were likely passed down for generations. That means a single, living lump of dough might have outlived entire dynasties. And no pressure, but if you ruined your mother's ancestral starter, you were probably cursed by at least 3 gods, and everyone in your village. Leavening brought variety, complexity, and height. Loaves could be tall, round, puffy, crusted on the outside and chewy inside. Bread now had structure. It wasn't just sustenance, it was an event. Rich households wanted it. Temples demanded it. Workers dreamed about it. And then came the yeast versus beer crossover. You see, beer and bread were twins. Same grains, same fermentation. Often the same equipment. In fact, some bakers used beer foam. Yes, actual bubbly residue as leavening. Others just dumped a little stale beer into the mix and hoped for the best. It wasn't exact science, but it worked. What's funny is that Egyptians didn't know the words yeast or bacteria. Germ theory wouldn't show up for another few thousand years, but they understood patterns. Dough that bubbled made better bread. Dough that didn't, flat, boring, heavy. You learned fast, or you stayed hungry. One particularly fringe practice. Some households allegedly used spit to kickstart fermentation. Chew up some grain, spit it into the mix, and wait. Yes, that's real. Fermentation needs enzymes. Your mouth has them. Bread was suddenly personal. Too personal, depending on who did the chewing. And of course, with better bread came better problems. Loaves that rose could also collapse. Over-ferment, and it turns sour. Under-bake, and it stays gummy inside. If you tried to rush the process, you got a gooey mess. But if you waited just the right amount of time, then magic. Warm, aromatic, life-giving magic. This also changed the shape of ovens. Flat rocks weren't good enough anymore. Egyptians used conical ovens with glowing interiors, like a pizza oven's scrappy ancestor. Some loaves were baked directly on the clay walls. Others were placed in pots or molds. A few were wrapped in leaves or bark, and some were just tossed into the fire and hoped for the best. Leavened bread also meant social signaling. The rich ate loaves with raisins, honey, or figs. The poor got whatever bubbled, and the temples? They baked elaborate, puffed-up offerings for the gods. Some loaves tall as a toddler, shaped into suns, scarabs, or ankhs. You didn't just bake, you declared your faith in gluten. And oh, the loaves they left behind. In tombs across the Nile, archaeologists have found carbonized remnants of risen bread. Some still carry thumbprints. Others have been hollowed by gas pockets, their crusts blackened but intact. These were the ancient world's baguettes, burnt, yes, but proud, and some still smell faintly of wheat, if you believe the more poetic field reports. Bread now entered the Egyptian vocabulary in dozens of forms. There were rolls, twists, braids, and rounds. Some were steamed, some baked dry, some coated in seeds. It wasn't just about survival, it was about choice and power, because whoever controlled the leavened bread controlled the people's happiness. You didn't need a scepter, you needed a spongy, golden loaf and a good delivery system. Remember those pyramid workers? Their rations changed when leavened bread became standard. Suddenly, they had more energy, fewer broken teeth, and slightly happier mealtimes. Feed the laborers became more efficient. Also, more delicious. Even scribes and middle-class artisans got in on the good bread, baking at home in miniature ovens, saving leftovers in baskets, and passing around starter dough like a communal pet. Here's the weird part. Once leavening spread, some temples and priests started rejecting it. For ritual reasons, only flat bread was pure, they said. Leavened bread was too unpredictable, too alive. It puffed up unnaturally. It rose on its own, suspicious. So while most Egyptians celebrated the fluff, the high priests quietly stuck to their crisp little discs of tradition. That theological divide, it's still around today. Rituals in Judaism, Christianity, and other faiths still debate whether bread should rise. Unleavened versus leavened, it's a drama older than most languages. But back in Egypt, leavened bread didn't care. It kept rising. It was everywhere, on tables, in tombs, in markets and marches, and morning rituals. It was quite literally the daily bread. And next, we turn to a civilization where bread meant power, politics, and panic. Rome's hungry, and Rome demands its loaf. So you've had your fill of sacred puffed loaves and sun-baked pyramids, and now you're heading west to Rome, where things get louder, messier, and far more legal. Because in Rome, bread wasn't just food. It was a tool, a tactic, a bribe, a threat, a national emergency waiting to happen. And if you think modern supply chains are dramatic, wait until you hear about grain riots that almost toppled emperors. The Roman Republic, and later the Empire, was built on conquest, marble, and sheer audacity. But underneath all that, bread, specifically, the constant panicked, often violent need to feed the mob. Rome's population grew so fast that it couldn't support itself agriculturally. The city relied almost entirely on grain shipments from North Africa, Sicily, and Egypt. Lose the grain, and you lost the people. And if you lost the people, well, good luck staying emperor. This is where you meet the infamous phrase, bread and circuses, panem circuses. It's not about decadence, it's about control. You keep the people fed, and you distract them with games, theater, and slightly questionable lion-related events. Do that, and they won't revolt. Maybe. So emperors like Augustus and Trajan institutionalized the annona, the state-run grain dole. Free or heavily subsidized grain was handed out to Roman citizens. At its peak, over 200,000 people received monthly rations. But here's the catch. This wasn't pre-baked bread. It was raw grain. You had to take it home and bake it yourself, or pay a professional baker to do it. Which brings us to the Roman baker class, or pistores. They were often slaves or freedmen, but they held a surprisingly powerful position. If the pistores went on strike, if grain shipments were delayed, or if a batch of bread came out underweight, instant unrest. A few bad loaves could spark a full-blown riot. One historian even described Roman bakers as held hostage by public appetite. And no pressure, but if the bread didn't show up, people died. Roman bread wasn't basic either. Sure, there was standard peasant fare, flat loaves, dense and dark, probably more fiber than flavor, but elite Romans. They demanded fine white bread, made with sifted flour so soft it was practically snobbery in powder form. And yes, the whiter your bread, the higher your status. A fluffier loaf meant you could afford slaves to sift the flour for you. This culinary classism was very real. Poor people ate black bread, often mixed with barley, oats, or whatever grains were cheapest. Soldiers ate hardtack, dry, hard biscuits that could survive a campaign but might also shatter your teeth. Rich people, on the other hand, enjoyed sourdoughs, seed breads, and even cheese-stuffed buns. And if you were really showing off, you carved your name into your loaf before baking it, which is exactly what archaeologists discovered in Pompeii. Yep, when Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 CE, it flash-baked an entire bakery mid-shift. Dozens of carbonized loaves were preserved, perfectly round, divided into 8 sections like a pizza, with the owner's stamp baked right into the top. Property of seller, because even when the world's ending, branding matters. These loaves were likely baked in beehive-shaped ovens, fueled by wood, and often shared communally. Bakers shaped the dough, pressed in a stamp, and let it rise before sliding it in on long wooden paddles. The smell, probably incredible. The health and safety standards, less so. And here's your fringe fact. Mules were used to knead dough in larger bakeries. Not men, not tools. Actual donkeys, walking in circles around a central mill, trampling dough underfoot, literally kneaded by hooves. You could taste the labor, and maybe the hay. But not everything was so rustic. Some bakeries had mechanical kneaders powered by cranks or animals. Others used large basins for communal dough mixing, and there were specialized bakers for different types of bread. Pistors candidari made the fine white loaves. Pistors critari handled moldy or reworked batches. Bread recycling, Roman style. Despite the range of options, hunger was never far away. One bad harvest, one pirate raid on a grain fleet, and Rome teetered. Emperors had to coordinate naval escorts, weather monitoring, and bribery just to keep bread flowing. When the Nile didn't flood, Rome went hungry. When a storm sank a shipment, the bakeries shut down. And when that happened, things burned. Literally. The city had grain storage fires so frequently they built entire brigades to prevent them. Sometimes bakers were blamed for cutting corners or watering dough. Others were attacked by mobs demanding loaves. Roman bread wasn't a meal, it was a pressure point, soft and golden on the outside, chaos on the inside. Still, some breads were delicious. Honeyed loaves, cheese pastries, spice rolls, and fritters. Romans loved a good crust. They dipped it in wine, stuffed it with olives, and used it to scoop sauces. It was utensil, side dish, and sponge. Breakfast, bread and garlic. Dinner, bread and beans. A hangover cure, bread soaked in vinegar. The loaf became a symbol too. Victorious generals distributed bread to their soldiers and fans. Coins were stamped with images of grain. Monuments honored bakers. The tomb of Eurysaces the baker, a freed slave, still stands today, designed to look like a giant bread oven. Subtle, but for all its ceremony, bread in Rome was still dangerous business. Underweight loaves were fined, black market flour was punishable, and in times of famine, bakers were sometimes accused of hoarding or treason. Being a baker meant feeding an empire. It also meant walking a razor's edge between praise and punishment. So while Romans expanded their territories, they also spread their bread. Wherever Rome conquered, the bakery followed. The oven, the kneading trough, the doughy politics of grain control, all of it marched alongside the legion. And as Rome crumbled, its loaves crumbled too. But the obsession stuck. Next stop, Judea, where bread wasn't just political, it was sacred, and sometimes forbidden to rise. If Rome baked bread to keep people quiet, then Judea baked it to keep them faithful. And unlike the rest of the ancient world, who were adding yeast, seeds, herbs, and donkey feet to the dough, the Hebrews were getting minimalist. Because here, bread wasn't about status or structure, it was about symbolism, identity, survival, and that meant no rising allowed. Unleavened bread, matzah, was central to Jewish ritual life. Crackly, flat, dry as dust, and specifically not fluffy, it was the spiritual opposite of everything Egypt had built. And that was no coincidence. The whole point was remembering the Exodus, the hasty departure from slavery in Egypt, when there was literally no time for dough to rise. You grabbed your flour, some water, maybe a pan, and got out of Pharaoh's kitchen. Freedom tasted like crackers. That act, rushing the bread, became law. During Passover, Jews weren't just eating unleavened bread, they were cleaning their homes of any chametz or fermented grain. Every crumb, every speck, gone. No puffed-up loaves, no yeasty softness. The bread had to be humble, honest, fast. But this wasn't just about speed baking, it was about the soul. Leavening in rabbinic texts came to represent arrogance, puffiness of spirit. So unleavened bread became a metaphor for humility, spiritual readiness, and memory. A reminder that you're not in control of the timeline, and also that even sacred snacks can taste like drywall. Now that's not to say Jews didn't eat leavened bread the rest of the year. They absolutely did. In fact, they had entire categories of it. Round loaves, braided challahs, spiced festival breads, and offerings brought to the temple in Jerusalem. Bread was a gift to God, but it had rules, and wow, were there a lot of rules. Temple bread, the lechem hapanim, or showbread, was a weekly ritual. 12 specially shaped loaves were baked by priests and placed on a golden table in the sanctuary. They had to be made just so in specific molds, with exact ingredients, and they had to stay fresh all week, miraculously. Some texts say they did, others raise eyebrows. Historians still argue whether the showbread was leavened or not. Some say it was puffed slightly, others insist it was crisp like matzah. Either way, it was holy, and possibly stale, by day 5. But ritual bread wasn't just for priests. Everyday Jewish life revolved around the Sabbath loaf, too. On Friday evenings, families baked or bought challah, a rich, slightly sweet, leavened bread. Often braided into intricate shapes, it symbolized manna from heaven, peace, and the double portion given before the Sabbath. You covered it with a cloth, said a blessing, and broke it with family. It was religion you could eat. Still, the laws around bread were complex. You couldn't mix dairy with meat, which affected what bread you paired with meals. You couldn't bake on the Sabbath, so everything had to be ready ahead of time. And if you lived in a mixed neighborhood, there were arguments. Whose oven could be used? Was it kosher? Did someone accidentally use lard? This created tension in the ancient world, especially under Greek and Roman rule, because while surrounding cultures were feasting on fluffy white loaves and butter-soaked buns, Jews were saying no, no, we won't eat your bread. No, we won't sacrifice it to your gods. No, we don't need it to rise. Bread became a line in the sand, and for some people, that line was threatening. Refusing to eat the same bread as your rulers wasn't just a culinary choice, it was rebellion. When Jews resisted forced Hellenization under the Seleucid Empire, one of the many pressure points was food. The Maccabean revolt. Yeah, it wasn't just about temples, it was also about ovens. Fringe fact, some Jewish sects during the Second Temple period insisted on baking their bread in total silence, no talking while kneading, shaping, or baking. It was a spiritual act, and words might contaminate the intention. So yes, imagine an entire bakery of extremely focused, extremely quiet bakers, probably sweating, definitely judging you. Bread was also used to mark time. The counting of the Omer, the days between Passover and Shavuot, was linked to the barley harvest, and offerings of loaves made from the new crop. This was sacred grain. First fruits, bread was a calendar you could choose. And when Jerusalem fell in 70 CE, and the temple was destroyed, so too went the bread rituals. No more showbread. No more sacred ovens in the priestly chambers. The center of Jewish bread-making shifted from temple courts to home kitchens, from offering tables to Sabbath meals, but the memory of it lingered. Some even baked loaves shaped like the temple bread, 12 small rolls arranged just so, as a way to remember. Others focused on the flatbread, doubling down on matzah as a symbol of survival. And throughout centuries of exile, pogroms, ghettos, and migration, Jewish communities held on to their bread laws, portable rituals, recipes smuggled in memory. Even in early Christian texts, bread remained symbolic. The Last Supper, unleavened bread, broken and shared, communion, a crumb of meaning. The New Testament is full of leaven metaphors, some hopeful, others cautionary, and again, The debate, should holy bread rise or stay humble? It's still being argued. For real. Churches split over it. So in Judea, bread wasn't an afterthought. It was an argument with time. A way of keeping stories alive when everything else was falling apart. A reminder that sometimes the flattest bread carries the deepest layers. And now that you've had your matzah, it's time to bite into something far less holy, medieval Europe, where bread could kill you, or, at best, deeply disappoint you. So, you've made it through the glory loaves of Rome, the sacred discs of Judea, and now you're slogging into medieval Europe land, of fog, feudalism, and truly abysmal bread. You thought matzah was dry. Welcome to 1,000 years of loaves that were black, bitter, sour, and occasionally laced with weeds, bark, or you're gonna love this, actual powdered bone. Let's set the scene. It's around the year 900, and you're living in a tiny village in what would eventually be called France, England, or Germany. You grow some grain, mostly rye and barley. Wheat is too expensive, too fragile, and pretty much reserved for monks and royalty. Your kitchen is a dirt floor, your water tastes like frogs, and your bread is, well, it's heavy. It lands on the table with a thud. It smells faintly of damp wood. It chews like rope, and it might turn green before you're done eating it. But it's bread, so you eat it. This era's loaves were often called maslin bread, a medieval term for flour mixtures made from whatever grains you could get your hands on. Barley, rye, oats, peas, beans, acorns. Yes, even fermented acorns got ground into flour during bad years. If it could be dried and pulverized, it might end up in your dough. This wasn't artisan, it was desperation cuisine. Flour quality varied wildly. If you lived near a watermill, you might get finely ground meal. If not, you used a quernstone, a flat rock, and a grinding stone you turned by hand until your arms fell off. It was exhausting, and your flour was full of grit. Not crunchy crust grit, actual rock dust from the grinding process. Dentists of the future would marvel at the ruined molars in medieval graves. Bread didn't just feed you, it filed your teeth. And there were no ovens in most homes. Baking bread meant using a communal oven, usually owned by the local lord or monastery. You made the dough at home, schlepped it down the muddy road, and paid a baking fee. Often a chunk of your bread, if you couldn't pay, or if you tried to bake secretly at home in a clay pot oven, that was illegal. Bread was taxed. And baking without permission was a minor crime. So yes, people risked arrest to make toast. And oh, the textures. These loaves were dense, not chewy or hearty, but brick-like. Cut one open and it crumbled into chunks, or oozed if the dough had been too wet. Mold could form in a day. Insects loved it, and if it sat too close to the hearth, it might get scorched on one side and stay raw in the middle. Bon appetit. Sometimes, you didn't even get a loaf. Poorer folks used trencher bread, a flat, stale slice of coarse bread used as a plate. You'd pile stew on it, eat with your fingers, and then if you had room, you'd eat the trencher itself. After soaking up gravy and meat juice, it was technically edible. If you were rich, you gave it to your dogs, or your servants, or the rats. Everyone ate well, eventually. Mainstream historical fact. Around the 13th century, towns began to regulate bread quality. In England, the assize of bread, yes, real name, was passed in 1266 to standardize the weight and price of loaves. Bakers who shorted customers could be fined, pilloried, or made to hand out free bread for a day. Hence the phrase baker's dozen, 13 loaves for the price of 12, just in case one was too small. Bread laws were serious. People died over loaves that were too light. And if you're wondering why it was always so dark, well, refined flour was a luxury. Only monasteries or noble estates had the means to sift out the bran and chaff. White bread became associated with purity, holiness, and status. Everyone else. Black bread, brown bread, bread, the color of despair. Fringe tidbit. In some famine years, people added tree bark to their flour. Dried ground pine bark could be used as filler. Mildly toxic, wildly unappetizing, but better than starving. Some old Nordic recipes even mention reindeer blood bread. Yes, That's exactly what it sounds like. And no, it's not coming back in a trendy food truck. And then there's the matter of holy bread. In monasteries, baking was a sacred act. Monks made bread as offerings, for communion, and for feeding the poor. They had access to better ovens, cleaner flour, and consistent recipes. Their loaves were softer, lighter, even tasty. Monastic bread was the medieval version of a five-star bakery. If you were lucky, you got a chunk during a feast. If not, well, back to the bar. But bread wasn't just food. It was a calendar. Lent meant less of it. Feasting days meant sweeter versions, made with eggs, milk, or spices if you could afford them. Some loaves were shaped into animals for festivals. Others were stamped with religious symbols. Bread marked time. It was ritual, routine. Often the only constant in a deeply inconsistent world, and sometimes it killed you. Because in certain damp regions, rye bread developed ergot, a toxic fungus that thrived on stored grain. Eat a loaf laced with it, and you might experience convulsions, hallucinations, gangrene, or death. Whole villages went mad, limbs turned black, and some scholars believe it contributed to witchcraft panics and religious visions. Was it a miracle, or just a moldy sandwich? Historians still argue. So no, medieval bread wasn't a crusty golden dream. It was survival, barely disguised. You choked it down, mumbled a prayer, and hoped it wouldn't bite back. Still, there was a strange comfort in it. The rough shape, the familiar chew, the way it warmed your hands on cold mornings. Bread was home, even if home smelled like damp stone and you had to gnaw your way through breakfast. And next, we're still in the muck. But now we're paying to use someone else's oven. Welcome to the feudal bread racket. By now you've endured the heavy loaves, the acorn ash, and the occasional hallucination. And somehow you're still here, teeth mostly intact. But now it's time to explore a lesser-known horror of medieval bread, feudal oven monopolies. Because as if the bread wasn't bad enough, you also had to ask permission to bake it, and then pay for the privilege. Let's say it's the 1300s. You live in a small European village. You've just spent hours grinding your own grain by hand, mixing it with water, praying to Saint whoever that your dough rises. And now, it's time to bake. But guess what? You can't. Because the oven, the only legal oven, is owned by the local lord. He controls the oven, the mill, sometimes the grain, and definitely your access to warm food. It's not personal, it's feudalism. You don't get to own infrastructure, you get to use it, for a fee. This wasn't just a village quirk, it was a full-blown system called the banalités in France, or manorial rights elsewhere. Lords had exclusive rights to essential services, baking, milling, pressing wine. If you wanted bread, you paid to use the oven. If you tried to build your own, that was illegal, even if it was just a clay dome in your backyard. Caught home baking, you could be fined, or your loaf confiscated, or your oven destroyed. There were even cases where villagers baked bread in secret, at night, risking punishment just to avoid the oven tax. Imagine sneaking through a forest with a bundle of dough, trying not to alert the Lord's steward. It's not exactly a great British bake-off tent, it's the great peasant bake heist. And you didn't just pay for baking, you paid for milling too. The Lord's mill crushed your grain for a fee. The Lord's wine press turned your grapes into drink for a fee. The whole thing was a medieval subscription service you couldn't cancel. Let's talk logistics. Communal ovens were large, stone or brick chambers with fire built up inside. Once the oven was hot enough, the ashes were scraped out, and loaves were shoved in on long paddles. Bread baked on the oven floor, sometimes resting on cabbage leaves or hay to prevent sticking. Not very sanitary, but effective. Your turn to bake came on rotation. There was no privacy, no quiet moments with your sourdough starter. Just villagers, loaves, and someone loudly arguing over who burned last week's batch. Bakers would score their loaves with personal marks, slashes, symbols, or stamps, so they could be identified after baking. That way, when someone inevitably charred your dough to oblivion, you knew exactly who to blame. Mainstream historical fact. These marks are one reason we know so much about medieval baking. Archaeologists have uncovered scorched loaves from abandoned ovens. still bearing unique scoring patterns. In a weird way, it's the earliest form of food branding, but while you were busy marking your dough, your lord was counting profits. Because, remember, grain meant money, and bread was the best way to turn that grain into value. Lords sometimes forced peasants to buy their flour exclusively from the manor mill. If your neighbor had extra grain and wanted to share, too bad, that could undermine the lord's monopoly. Some lords even hoarded grain in times of famine, selling it back at inflated prices. Bread became political leverage. The difference between survival and starvation was who controlled the oven. Fringe tidbit: in some cases, lords claimed the right of first loaf, a symbolic slice of every peasant's bake. This wasn't nutritional, it was feudal theatrics, a daily reminder of who owned your livelihood, one crust at a time. Now, in cities, things were a bit more sophisticated. Guilds of professional bakers emerged in places like Paris, London, and Florence. These bakers had to follow strict laws about bread weight, flour quality, and pricing. A light loaf meant a heavy fine. A bad batch might earn you public humiliation, or in some cities, a brief stay in the stocks with stale loaves tied around your neck. Bakers were serious about bread, but so were the customers. One documented case from 14th century France describes a baker being fined for making loaves too small. The punishment? Giving away a full day's worth of bread. Free. Not a terrible sentence, unless it happened repeatedly. Which it did. Yet even guild bakers struggled. Flour prices fluctuated wildly, fires destroyed ovens, and sometimes their own workers rebelled. Apprentices going on strike because they were overworked, underfed, or covered in flour 24/7. Bread, it turned out, was not a peaceful business. Still, feudal baking was strangely communal. Entire villages gathered at the oven. Gossip flowed with the rising steam. Children played near the fire, unsafe. Yes, neighbors shared tips, argued about rye ratios, and judged each other's crusts. It was loud, chaotic, and essential. The daily bake was also the daily check-in. Who was alive? Who was sick? Who added chickpeas to the dough this week and got fancy? But let's not pretend this was charming. Most of the time, the bread was still awful. Flat, sour, and full of bark, or bean flour. And thanks to seasonal variation, sometimes there was no grain at all, just hope, or moth. You waited in line, you paid your fee, you got a scorched brick that weighed 2 pounds and tasted like wet fireplace. You dunked it in broth, gnawed the crust, and went to bed chewing. But one day, someone got tired of the taxes, the restrictions, the bread that broke teeth and spirits, and slowly, quietly, that dissatisfaction began to rise. Because when people have nothing left to lose, and nothing left to eat, they riot. Now the bread's really about to hit the fan. So far, it's been bitter loaves, bark flour, and oven taxes. But now we've arrived at one of the most terrifying chapters in bread's long, crusty history. The part where it stops being merely disappointing and starts actively poisoning you. Say hello to ergot. You're a peasant in a damp European village. You've just survived another rough winter. The grain was a little moldy when you milled it, but it smelled, okay, maybe a little sour. But bread is bread, and you've got mouths to feed. You mix, knead and bake, then you eat. The next day, your fingers tingle, your legs cramp, your skin feels like it's on fire, and then you start to hallucinate. Welcome to St. Anthony's Fire, also known as ergotism, a full-body horror show caused by a fungal infection in rye, ergot. Claviceps pietera, if you're curious and have a microscope, thrives in damp, cool climates. It infects the grain heads and replaces kernels with long, dark, purplish bodies. Spurs filled with alkaloids chemically similar to LSD. That's right, medieval villagers were unknowingly microdosing nightmare bread. But unlike modern psychedelics, this wasn't peace and enlightenment. It was burning, twisting pain. Two types of ergotism existed. Convulsive ergotism involved spasms, hallucinations, psychosis, and violent fits. Gangrenous ergotism, on the other hand, restricted blood flow, causing limbs to blacken, rot, and fall off. Not metaphorically, actually fall off. Whole communities were struck. Imagine a village where dozens of people suddenly can't walk, or begin screaming about demons, or simply collapse mid-meal. Some burned with fever, others saw visions. A few claimed to see saints. More likely they saw their own hands turning purple and dying. Mainstream historical fact. In 857 CE, a documented outbreak in the Rhine Valley killed thousands. And this wasn't a one-time event. Ergotism persisted, sporadically, for centuries. It was only in the 18th century that people fully understood it was the rye, not the wrath of God, that caused the suffering. And yet for hundreds of years, no one connected bread with the symptoms. How could they? Bread was life. Bread was holy. Bread was the one thing everyone trusted. So when people got sick, they didn't blame the loaf. They blamed witches. Yes, witches. Because what else could cause children to convulse, farmers to scream, women to see demons in the sky? In parts of France, Germany and Switzerland, ergotism outbreaks directly overlapped with witch trials. You eat some bad rye, your neighbor starts dancing uncontrollably, the priest thinks it's Satan, the village holds a trial, someone dies again. Historians still argue whether some of the infamous witch panics, including the Salem trials, were influenced by ergot-contaminated bread. It's possible the symptoms match. The timing fits. But no one's sure. What is clear is that bread, the stuff that was supposed to nourish, became a vector for fear. And if ergot didn't get you, other bad breads might. Grain stored improperly rotted, dough left too long, could go rancid, bread might mold, harden into stone, or soak up soot from a poorly maintained oven. Poor sanitation meant rat droppings and insects mixed with the flour. And if you were unlucky enough to eat spoiled grain, you'd suffer dysentery, vomiting, or something politely called wasting. That's medieval for good luck with that. Still, bread was so central, people didn't have a choice. There were no alternatives, no rice, no pasta, no sweet little boxes of cereal. You ate bread, or you didn't eat. And that desperation made bread a political weapon. Rulers could control their population by controlling the grain. Bread shortages meant riots. In 14th century Paris, bakeries were attacked during shortages. In England, grain hoarders were hanged. Even monks got caught in the chaos. One account from a German abbey in 1316 describes starving peasants storming the monastery and dragging off barrels of grain. The monks tried to bake loaves and calm them down. It didn't work. Fringe tidbit. During the 14th century Great Famine, some bakeries started baking famine bread, a horrifying combination of straw, ground ferns, bean husks, and clay. That's not hyperbole. Clay was used to bulk out flour. It gave the illusion of fullness. It also probably gave you gastrointestinal problems that didn't end well. And let's not forget the plague years, when the Black Death hit Europe in the 1340s. Everything collapsed: markets, supply chains, farming systems. Grain rotted in fields. Ovens went cold. Whole villages died before the next loaf could rise. In some areas, surviving bakers charged extortionate prices. Others gave out bread for free and were mobbed. Bread riots, again and again. Yet even in all this darkness, people kept baking. Bread, adapted, ritual loaves for funerals. Spiced breads with dried fruit to mark the end of plague waves. Saint Day breads shaped like animals or saints themselves, to ward off disease. Because if you couldn't fight the sickness, maybe you could eat a protective pastry. One popular tradition: baking crosses into the top of loaves, part religious, part practical. The cross allowed steam to escape, and the loaf to bake evenly. But to the medieval baker, it also blessed the bread. In some villages, no one would cut a loaf without crossing themselves first. Still, every bite was a gamble. And so you ate carefully, you watched the color, you smelled for mold, you prayed over the crust. And if your fingers started tingling, well, you hoped it was just the cold. Up next, the Renaissance is coming, and with it, classier crusts, flamboyant flour politics, and yet another round of punishment for underweight loaves. By the time the Renaissance rolled around, bread was still your constant companion, warm, uneven, occasionally fatal. But now it started to reflect something new. class. A simple loaf could now tell you everything about someone, their wealth, their rank, whether they lived in a villa or a tenement, whether they had servants to sift their flour, or if they were chewing on pebbles for dinner. Because in Renaissance Europe, bread became visibly, undeniably hierarchical. Let's start with the obvious. White bread. In cities like Florence, Paris, and London, white bread wasn't just food, it was a fashion statement. The paler the loaf, the higher your status. To achieve that porcelain finish, bakers had to triple sift flour, removing the bran and germ to leave only the purest, softest part of the wheat. It was wasteful, expensive, and in the eyes of the wealthy, absolutely necessary. If your bread didn't look like a cloud, you were obviously a commoner. This gave rise to an entire bread caste system. The rich ate manchet, a soft, white, buttery bread made from the finest wheat. The middle class might get away with ravel or wheaten. Still decent, but with a little more texture. The poor, they got horse bread, dense, dark, and bulked with everything from peas and beans to ground up old loaves and occasionally sawdust. And yes, the color of your bread was literally policed. In some cities, bakers were banned from selling white bread to the poor or dark bread to the rich. That way, you couldn't pretend to be someone you weren't. Bread wasn't just sustenance, it was surveillance, and with this obsession came stricter laws. Remember the assize of bread from earlier? Still going strong, cities had officials known as bread weighers, whose job was to inspect loaves at market stalls. If a baker's bread was underweight or overcharged, they could face public punishment. Sometimes they were paraded through the streets with bad loaves tied around their neck. Other times they were pilloried. Yes, the wooden stocks for the crime of crust fraud. Mainstream historical fact. In 16th century England, it was common to publicly flog bakers who cheated on flour weight. One court document even records a baker being fined for adding chalk and bones to bread flour. And no, that wasn't slang. They meant actual chalk and powdered animal bones. You can imagine how that went down with customers. But even when bread wasn't laced with calcium supplements, it was still risky. Flour adulteration was rampant. Some bakers added alum to bleach the dough, or lime to increase bulk. Others mixed in old, moldy flour to stretch fresh batches. As long as it looked pale, most people wouldn't question it until their stomachs did. And yet, bread was also becoming beautiful. Renaissance bakers got fancy. Loaves were sculpted into braids, spirals, crowns, and knots. For festivals or weddings, bread was shaped like birds, swords, flowers, and elaborate shields. Some were dusted with spices or layered with nuts and honey. Bakers competed for royal patronage by designing the most Instagram-worthy pre-Instagram loaves. One fringe tidbit. In Italian courts, bread was served in shapes that matched the host's coat of arms. Imagine biting into your family crest. Now that's luxury carbs. Even the way people ate bread became stylized. In elite dining halls, a slice of manchet was used as a sort of edible napkin, held in the left hand to avoid greasy fingers. Crumbs were brushed from silk tunics with miniature feather brushes. Breadcrumbs, feather brushes. There are whole chapters of Renaissance etiquette books devoted to it. Because heaven forbid your sleeve should get oily. Meanwhile, the lower classes were still trying to eat anything. When grain prices rose, which they did often, thanks to wars, bad harvests, and royal hoarding, people rioted. Bread riots became regular features of city life. In Paris, the flour wars of 1775 saw mobs attacking bakeries, accusing them of fixing prices. In Italy, towns posted bread tariffs on the church door to prevent bakers from charging too much. And it wasn't just about cost, it was about dignity. In many places, charity bread called alms loaves was distributed to the poor on Sundays. But these loaves were often marked, shaped, or stamped to indicate their low status. If you ate one in public, everyone knew. Some were even intentionally made smaller or thinner, not out of economy, but out of social signaling. So yes, people were being shamed via bread geometry, and yet bread remained sacred. In churches, the Eucharist continued to center around bread, unleavened, flat, symbolic, and consumed in solemn silence It was bread stripped of status, just body, just memory, just ritual. It was the one place where bread might be equal, but only might. In Catholic churches, only priests received the wine and the bread. The congregation often just watched. Meanwhile, in Protestant regions, communion became more democratic. Everyone received both bread and wine, symbolizing a shift, not just in theology, but in how people viewed access, even to sacred carbs. So while Renaissance art blossomed, and cities grew, and science stirred, bread stayed central. More beautiful, more symbolic. But still, for most people, still a little bit awful, still dry, or bitter, or too dark, or too light, or just barely enough to keep the hunger away. And soon, the world would change again. Empires were sailing, colonies were forming, and Europe was bringing its flour and its flour opinions across the ocean. Next up, the New World, where bread meets corn, confusion, and one deeply grumpy Puritan. The Renaissance gave you braided bread, bread riots, and powdered bones, but now you're sailing west, into the New World, where the loaves are about to get weird. Because when Europeans arrived in the Americas, they brought wheat and discovered that North America didn't care at all. It was like baking bread in a universe that politely refused to rise. Let's start with wheat. Europeans adored it. They saw it as a civilizing grain, the foundation of cities, religion, and proper meals. But when settlers tried planting it in North America's wild soils and unpredictable climates, it flopped. Literally, early wheat crops failed spectacularly. Sometimes it didn't germinate. Sometimes it grew tall and collapsed. Sometimes bugs ate it first. So the colonists had a choice: starve or adapt. Enter corn, already being grown by indigenous peoples in dozens of varieties, from golden maize to blue, red, and even spotted kernels. It was hearty, fast-growing, and perfect for the local environment. And it made something resembling bread, but not to the European eye. Cornbread was a revelation to some, and a complete disappointment to others. It didn't rise the same way. It didn't knead properly. It lacked gluten, that magical protein that gives wheat bread its chewy structure. Cornmeal just kind of sat there, crumbly, flat, confused, like bread that had given up halfway through. Still, it worked. Colonists began mixing cornmeal with water, milk or buttermilk. Some added bacon fat. Others used ash from burned corn cobs as leavening. The results: ash cakes, baked directly in embers. Quick, hot, earthy, tasted like survival, with a hint of soot. In some regions, cornmeal was combined with a little wheat flour, if you could get it, and baked into journey cakes, later shortened to johnny cakes. Sturdy, long-lasting, and perfect for people traveling long distances with no access to ovens or bakeries. But for many Europeans, especially the Puritans, this was unacceptable. Wheat was holy. It was in the Bible. It was used for communion. It rose the way it was supposed to. Cornbread, too rustic, too indigenous, too strange. Some Puritan diaries are full of complaints about the coarse Indian cake they were forced to eat. One famously grumbled that he would eat wood before I eat another maize loaf. He probably did. Still, native peoples had been making sophisticated bread-like dishes long before colonists arrived. The Pueblo made cornmeal flatbreads on hot stones. The Cherokee used soaked, nixtamalized corn, which unlocked vital nutrients to create mushes and cakes. Many groups used ashes, or plant ash water, to help bind and puff the dough. And here's the wild part. Most of these breads were healthier than the hardtack and moldy wheat loaves brought from Europe. Nixtamalized corn contained more available niacin. It was easier to digest. But because it didn't look like European bread, it was dismissed. Fringe tidbit. Some settlers tried to grow European rye and accidentally created mutant strains by crossbreeding with local wild grasses. These hybrids had names like Canada Blue Wheat or Goose Rye. They baked terribly and tasted worse. But hey, at least they were trying. Eventually, wheat farming improved. Colonists brought hardier varieties. Some worked the land until it submitted. Wheat began to grow in pockets of the Northeast and Midwest. In Virginia, Plantation owners cultivated small wheat plots with the help of enslaved labor. In Pennsylvania, German immigrants baked dark, hearty rye loaves, and slowly, regional bread cultures began to form. But this bread wasn't just for eating. It was for trading. Colonists sold bread and flour to other colonies, to the Caribbean, to European ships docking in ports. By the 18th century, bread had become business, and some cities like Boston had thriving bakery scenes. Still, the class divide remained. The wealthy bought white bread. The poor made corn cakes, and enslaved Africans, forced to cook for both themselves and their enslavers, adapted recipes using cornmeal, okra, and African spices. Hoe cakes, cornmeal patties fried on iron tools, became a staple, portable, fast, resistant to both hunger and judgment. Mainstream historical fact: George Washington loved hoe cakes. He reportedly ate them every morning for breakfast, drowned in butter and honey, which goes to show, even the founding fathers needed fried bread to face the day. By the time the American Revolution arrived, bread was political again. British blockades led to flour shortages. Patriot newspapers urged citizens to bake with local grain, corn, oats, barley, anything to avoid British imports. Recipes for Liberty bread spread, which was basically cornbread with a title. Meanwhile, loyalists still clung to British-style wheat loaves. Yes, people judged each other by their crust. Bread became a quiet declaration of allegiance. Cornbread? Revolutionary. White bread? Questionable. It was patriotism baked in an iron skillet. And bread even showed up in wartime insults. Soldiers mocked each other for what they were issued. British troops got biscuit rations. American soldiers chewed dense corn cakes. The French, who later helped the revolutionaries, brought their own fluffy baguette-like rations. Probably the most elegant battlefield snack ever created. But perhaps the oddest moment came after the war, when Americans still couldn't agree on what counted as good bread. Northern cities leaned toward yeast-raised wheat loaves. The South embraced buttermilk biscuits and cornbread. And in the middle, people just kept eating whatever they could grow. One last weird detail: colonial bread stamps. Some bakeries marked loaves with metal stamps bearing images of sheaves, stars, or even George Washington's face. Bread wasn't just food, it was branding. So here you are, in a new world full of contradictions. Bread that won the war, bread that divided classes, bread that refused to rise unless you tricked it. But despite the grumbling, everyone kept baking, even if it meant frying cornmeal in bacon grease on the back of a hoe. Because in the end it was still warm, still filling, still somehow bread. Next up, the industrial age. Sliced, steamed, bleached, and about to become the weirdest white sponge you've ever eaten. Welcome to the industrial age, where bread, once handmade, heartfelt, and occasionally full of bark, becomes something else entirely. Mechanized, mass-produced, mysteriously fluffy, and often so white it practically glows in the dark. Because now, bread doesn't rise on a hearthstone, it rises on assembly lines. It all begins in the 19th century. Cities are booming, populations are exploding, people are working longer hours, living in tighter spaces, and demanding food that's fast, cheap, and doesn't involve grinding grain by candlelight. So the baking industry steps in with something new: factory loaves. The first big shift: steam-powered mills. Previously, flour was ground with water wheels or donkeys, and it came out gritty, dark, and full of texture. But now, thanks to steel rollers and industrial sifters, millers could produce superfine, snow-white flour. All the bran and germ, the nutritious bits, were removed. What remained was the starchy center of the wheat kernel, soft, pale, and eerily uniform. This wasn't an accident. White flour didn't just bake differently, it was marketed differently. It was seen as clean, pure, scientific, a break from the dirty peasant past. White bread wasn't just food, it was modernity in loaf form. And of course, this meant class lines got redrawn again. Poor folks, who once chewed dark rye in silence, now aspired to white bread. Middle-class families bought it by the armful. Rich families still had fresh loaves delivered daily, but now they came from steam bakeries, not monasteries. These new bakeries could produce thousands of loaves a day. They were filled with machines, dough mixers the size of bathtubs, automated kneaders, conveyors, paddle-fed ovens. Everything moved like clockwork. Uniform heat, uniform shape, uniform crust. And just when it couldn't get more modern, someone sliced it. Yes, pre-sliced bread enters the scene in 1928, thanks to Otto Frederick Rohwedder, an Iowa-born inventor with an unshakable belief that knives were overrated. His machine not only sliced the loaf, it wrapped it too. So it stayed soft, clean, untouched by human hands. You could grab a slice straight from the bag. No crumbs, no mess, just convenience. The public went nuts. Within 5 years, nearly every commercial bakery had adopted slicing. Ads called it the greatest forward step in baking since bread was wrapped. And that's where we got the phrase, the best thing since sliced bread, which, honestly, is still pretty accurate. But here's the trade-off. Mass-produced bread wasn't delicious. It was soft. Yes, it was fluffy, but it was also bland, squishy, and structurally weak. You couldn't tear it, you smudged it, you couldn't smell it, you just unwrapped it, and mainstream historical fact. By 1930, Wonder Bread, yes, that Wonder Bread had become the symbol of factory baking. A white, spongy loaf, sliced and bagged in a colorful polka dot wrapper. Kids loved it. Nutritionists were skeptical. Bakers were split, because sure, it was efficient, but it was also void of fiber, flavor, and anything resembling grain. To make up for that, companies started fortifying flour with vitamins and minerals, thiamine, iron, niacin, things naturally found in wheat, now chemically put back in after being milled out. A nutritional round trip. Still, it helped combat deficiency diseases like Pellagram berberi in poorer communities. So, a weird win. But that wasn't the end of the innovation. Enter chemical additives. In the quest for ever faster rising and ever squishier crumbs, bakers turned to ingredients like potassium bromate, a dough strengthener later linked to health concerns, bleaching agents to make flour whiter, and emulsifiers to keep slices from staling. Bread stopped being just flour, water, salt, and yeast. It became a science experiment in a plastic bag. Fringe tidbit. One of the first commercial ads for factory bread described it as untouched by human hands, which at the time was a huge selling point. Clean, sterile, clinical. Basically food that didn't feel like food. And yet, people adored it. Mothers didn't have to bake. Lunches were easier. Sandwiches stayed soft. Bread became a household default, not an occasion. You ate it for breakfast, for lunch, for dinner, for school snacks. Always sliced, always white, always bland. But even as the bread rose, the critics did too. Some bakers called it cotton bread, so airy it collapsed under its own weight. Others mocked the nutritional theater of adding vitamins to something stripped of substance. Immigrant communities clung to their old breads, rye, sourdough, challah, pitta, and looked at factory loaves with side eye. Still, the march of sliced bread continued. Supermarkets expanded. Bakeries shrank. And by mid-century, homemade bread was practically a hobby. If you baked, it was for fun, or nostalgia, or rebellion. Which is ironic, because just a few centuries earlier, baking bread at home could get you arrested. Now, you had to fight to remember what real bread tasted like. But don't worry, someone was about to fight back. Armed with whole grains, wild yeast, and very smug tote bags, they would stage a counter-revolution. Because bread had gone too far. Next up, the war over bleached flour, the hippie rise of whole wheat, and why some people started baking loaves that weighed more than their dog. So we've sliced it, bleached it, shrink-wrapped it, and called it a modern miracle. But by the mid-20th century, a quiet rebellion was simmering inside health food co-ops, hippie communes, and surprisingly angry bakery basements. The war on white bread had begun, because eventually, people started to notice. Factory bread didn't taste like anything. It was soft. Yes, it was efficient. But it was also bland, bloated, and suspiciously shelf-stable. And more importantly, it wasn't bread anymore. not in the ancestral, toothsome, soul-warming sense. Enter the whole wheat movement. At first it was tiny, fringe, weird. Just a handful of nutrition nuts and back-to-the-land idealists mumbling about bran content and blood sugar. But slowly, they gained ground. Why? Because they started saying what a lot of people were already feeling, that maybe, just maybe, your loaf shouldn't be the consistency of memory foam. The argument went like this. Factory bread was stripped of everything that made bread real. The bran and germ, the parts with fiber, flavor, and nutrients were milled out. Then artificial vitamins were dumped back in, like giving someone a salad after you stole their liver. Whole wheat, on the other hand, kept all the parts. It was hearty, nutty, chewy, actual food. And so began the age of the health loaf. Whole wheat bread, dense, brown, full of texture, became the badge of the awakened. If you bought it, you were probably reading nutrition labels, grinding your own grain, or yelling at your children about preservatives. The loaves were often hand-shaped, sometimes overbaked, and frequently weighed as much as a house cat. They weren't pretty, but they were honest. One of the key voices in this bread-based uprising, a man named Bernard Jensen, a chiropractor and health food evangelist who in the 1950s declared white bread the staff of death. Not very subtle, but effective. Soon others joined in, nutritionists, naturopaths, even dentists, who linked white bread to cavities, fatigue, and moral decline. Okay, maybe not all of that, but the backlash was real. By the 1970s, the health food counterculture was in full swing. In Berkeley, California, tiny bakeries sprouted up with names like the Grateful Bread and Loaf and Let Die. These weren't your usual shops. They used stone-ground flour, wild yeast, and zero shortcuts. Some even baked their loaves in wood-fired ovens, returning to pre-industrial methods, like it was 1347, but with better hygiene. Mainstream historical fact. The Erehon Food Company, founded in the 1960s, was one of the first to mass-produce whole-grain macrobiotic bread. It was chewy, dense, and often came with a side of existential dread. But it sparked a wave of real bread enthusiasm that helped reshape the market. But like all revolutions, the health loaf rebellion had its quirks. Some early health bakers made loaves so heavy they could be used as doorstops. Others avoided salt entirely for purity, resulting in bread that tasted like damp cardboard. There were loaves with so many sunflower seeds that they physically hurt to chew. People tolerated it. Why? Because it felt righteous. And then came the sprouted grain crowd. These folks argued that bread should begin not with flour, but with living, sprouted seeds, germinated until they were on the verge of planthood, then mashed into dough. It was expensive, time-consuming, and deeply impractical, but it felt like the antidote to corporate white sponge loaves. Even supermarkets noticed. By the late 80s and early 90s, brands like Arnold and Pepperidge Farm began releasing whole grain options. Sometimes actually whole grain, sometimes just tan-colored white bread wearing a healthy disguise. You had to check the label. Was whole wheat the first ingredient? Or was it enriched bleached flour? The war of crusts went from the oven to the fine print. And lurking beneath it all, bleach. Yes, flour was still being chemically bleached to improve appearance and baking consistency. Chemicals like benzoyl peroxide and potassium bromate were used to whiten the flour and strengthen dough. Were they safe? The FDA said yes. Other countries like the UK, Canada, and most of the EU said no thanks and banned them. Historians still argue whether the long-term effects were ever worth the aesthetics. Fringe tidbit. Some bakers during this period used a bizarre natural bleaching technique involving sunlight and flour spread on flat roofs. It took weeks. It wasn't practical, but it was a way to say, hey, we're not that kind of bakery. Meanwhile, back in the land of mass production, Wonder Bread doubled down. They launched ads declaring their loaves had more calcium than a glass of milk, 12 essential vitamins, and the taste kids love. They weren't wrong. Kids did love it. It was soft, it made perfect grilled cheese. And it could be rolled into a tight ball and used to plug leaky faucets. A very versatile product. But the tide was shifting. Cooks like James Beard started publishing bread cookbooks in the 1970s, encouraging Americans to bake at home again. and the seeds of the artisan bread movement were being planted quietly, crustily, by bakers who missed the crackle of a real crust and the tang of fermentation. By the 1990s, artisan loaves were turning up in fancy restaurants and specialty shops. You could now buy ciabatta, pain de campagne, and rye, with fennel seed, in public, without judgment. Bread was cool again, not convenient, not fortified, but real. Still, most of the country remained loyal to sliced white bread, in lunchboxes, on supermarket shelves, as burger buns and hot dog pillows. It was cheap, fast, predictable, and while it didn't nourish the soul, it didn't ask much of you either. But storm clouds were forming, a new threat was rising, or rather, not rising, because in the early 2000s, bread met its next nemesis, gluten. You've trudged through bark bread, bleach bread, and back to the land bread. But now, you've arrived at the great 21st century food panic, gluten. One of the most ancient, essential proteins in human culinary history was about to become the villain. Let's rewind for a second. Gluten is what makes bread. Well, bread. It's a group of proteins, mostly glutenin and gliadin, that form long, stretchy chains when flour is mixed with water and kneaded. That structure traps gas from yeast, allowing dough to rise, stretch, and hold shape. It's what gives bread its chew, its bounce, its life. Without gluten, your loaf is a crumbly brick, a tragedy. But starting in the late 1990s and ramping up dramatically in the 2000s, gluten became a source of growing suspicion. What was once considered harmless, beloved, even, was now being blamed for everything from bloating to brain fog. It started, reasonably enough, with people who have celiac disease, an autoimmune condition where ingesting gluten damages the small intestine. For them, eating a sandwich isn't annoying, it's dangerous. Celiac is very real, very painful, and absolutely demands a gluten-free diet. Mainstream historical fact. Celiac disease was first formally described by Dr. Samuel G. in 1888, but it took until the mid-20th century to confirm that gluten, not just wheat, was the trigger. Then came the next wave, non-celiac gluten sensitivity. People who didn't have the autoimmune response but claimed that gluten made them feel sluggish, gassy, irritable, foggy. Doctors debated it. Nutritionists argued. Historians still argue whether this is a real diagnosis or just the result of modern diets, stress, and too many food blogs. Either way, gluten was now on trial. In the early 2000s, the gluten-free market exploded. Suddenly, entire grocery aisles were devoted to rice flour muffins, tapioca bread, and crackers made of air and hope. Restaurants scrambled to offer gluten-free options. Servers began whispering about cross-contamination like it was a biohazard. And the bread? It got weird. To replace gluten's elasticity, bakers turned to xanthan gum, guar gum, chia gel, and a whole lineup of starchy acrobats. The results? Mixed. Some gluten-free breads were impressive. Others fell apart mid-slice or had the texture of compressed lint. But still, people bought them, because gluten had been cast as the enemy. White bread? Evil. Whole wheat? Suspicious. Sourdough? Maybe okay, but let's double check. Some blamed modern wheat itself. They argued that ancient grains like einkorn, spelt, and kamut had less gluten and were gentler on the body. These grains re-emerged like forgotten relatives at a family reunion. Exotic, slightly dusty, and suddenly popular. Fringe tidbit. Some alternative medicine circles started promoting the idea that gluten caused depression, anxiety, even autism. There was no reliable evidence, but the rumors spread. Bread wasn't just toast now. It was a threat to civilization. This fear wasn't just about nutrition, it was about control. The modern world felt chaotic. Politics, climate, social media doom scrolling. And here was something physical you could cut out. A scapegoat. A chewy golden scapegoat with sesame seeds. And yet, even in the gluten panic, a sourdough renaissance quietly blossomed. Because sourdough, with its wild yeasts and long fermentation, breaks down some of the gluten naturally. Some people who struggled with supermarket loaves found they could tolerate slow reason handmade bread. It wasn't a cure, but it was a loophole, one that involved starter jars and Instagram reels of crusty loaf cracks. At the same time, bread began reappearing in celebrity chef kitchens, food blogs, and hipster cafes. But not just any bread, artisan bread, bubbly, crusty, made with ancient flours and harvested sea salt and spring water, blessed by mountain goats, the kind of bread that cost $9 and came in a wax paper bag with no logo, just vibes. The artisan movement didn't just respond to gluten fear, it defied it. Real bread, it said, was good for you. Real bread didn't need fortification, or chemical dough conditioners, or 16 types of sugar, just flour, water, salt, thyme, and people listened. Home bakers multiplied. During the COVID-19 pandemic, sourdough starters became emotional support pets. People named them, fed them, cried over their failed loaves. The smell of toasted crust became comfort in uncertain times. One mainstream 2020 headline read, "Flour shortage hits US as nation rediscovers baking." It was true, bread was back. People were baking for the first time in years, sometimes decades, because despite all the panic, despite all the wariness, something in us still trusted that moment of slicing into a fresh loaf. Still, the gluten-free market didn't go away, and neither did the debates. Are modern wheat strains harder to digest? Are food additives to blame? Is it gluten, or glyphosate, or too much screen time? Historians still argue, but one thing is clear, bread survived. Even when it was demonized, even when it made people sick, even when it lost its soul in a plastic wrapper, even when it got replaced by kale chips and almond flour cupcakes. Because the truth is, gluten isn't the villain. It's a protein, it's structure, it's tradition, it's the difference between dough and soup. And when handled with care, when baked with intention, gluten is what gives bread its spirit. But speaking of spirit, next up, the cult of sourdough, the wild yeasts, the crumb shots, and the surprisingly intense personalities behind the starter jars. If gluten was the villain of the early 2000s, then sourdough was the misunderstood anti-hero, funky, wild, ancient, and here to restore bread's honor, one crusty loaf at a time. This was no marketing gimmick. Sourdough had been around for thousands of years. It was likely the very first leavened bread born when some lazy Mesopotamian or Egyptian left dough out overnight and woke up to a puffed-up miracle. But now, in the 21st century, it returned with a new identity, artisan icon, fermentation rock star, and let's be honest, Instagram heartthrob. At the center of it all, the starter. A simple mix of flour and water, left out to ferment naturally, attracting wild yeast from the air, your hands and the flour itself. Fed daily or not, named lovingly or mockingly, it bubbles, rises, and smells somewhere between gym socks and fine wine. Some are sweet, some are aggressive, all are temperamental. The starter is alive, and it knows when you're afraid. Fringe tidbit. Bakers have actually named their starters and passed them down like heirlooms. There's Carl Griffith's 1847 Oregon Trail sourdough starter, still maintained and mailed to enthusiasts today. Yes, people mail dried starter across the globe, like edible pen pals. Once you have your starter, you mix it with flour, water, and salt. No instant yeast, no shortcuts, just time, because sourdough takes hours, even days. First the bulk rise, then shaping, then proofing, then baking, all while trying to avoid overproofing, underproofing, sticky dough syndrome, or, heaven forbid, a dense crumb. And that crumb? Oh, it matters, because once sourdough took over the baking world, it also took over the internet. Forums, YouTube channels, Instagram pages, all comparing crumb shots. The holy grail being the open crumb, big, irregular holes, shiny webs of gluten, the kind of structure that says, yes, I spent 16 hours making this, and yes, I deserve praise. Baking groups online began analyzing loaves like art critics. Nice ears, great blistering, needs more oven spring. If you didn't know better, you'd think they were talking about racehorses or skincare. And yes, oven spring is a real term. It's the final burst of rise when a loaf hits a hot oven, the crust forming, the interior expanding like a balloon of ambition. If your dough was shaped well, scored confidently, and proofed just right, boom, you get the spring. If not, flat, sad, delicious, still, but not photogenic. Mainstream historical fact. The word sourdough became associated with San Francisco during the gold rush. Miners kept starters in leather pouches or canteens, feeding them as they traveled. The city's wild yeasts, especially Lactobacillus sanfrancisensis, gave the bread its distinctive tang. To this day, San Francisco sourdough is considered the classic, but now it's global. From Tokyo to Buenos Aires, Berlin to Melbourne, sourdough became a lifestyle. There were sourdough retreats, sourdough yoga, and entire cookbooks written like personal memoirs about how the author found themselves and spiritual healing through crust and fermentation. It got weird, and also kind of beautiful. During the COVID-19 pandemic, as store shelves emptied and sourdough became an at-home obsession, starter jars multiplied across kitchens like sour-smelling gremlins. People who had never baked before were suddenly consulting hydration ratios and purchasing Dutch ovens like their lives depended on it. Some failed, some triumphed. All posted photos. But sourdough wasn't just hipster nostalgia. It was part science, part ritual, a slow, meditative process in a world that increasingly demanded speed. You couldn't rush a sourdough loaf. You had to plan. You had to commit. It was the opposite of factory bread. Even commercial bakeries got in on it. Supermarket chains released sourdough-style loaves, many made with a hint of vinegar or a powdered starter to simulate the flavor, if not the process. Purists scoffed. But for most shoppers, close enough was good enough. Still, for the diehards, real sourdough was a return to roots. It had flavor, tang, texture, crust you could knock on. It toasted like a dream. It filled your kitchen with the kind of smell that makes you forgive your ancestors for centuries of rye poison. And beyond flavor, sourdough had function. The long fermentation helped pre-digest some of the gluten, which made it more tolerable for some with mild sensitivities. It had a lower glycemic index. It resisted mold naturally. And it didn't need 20 chemicals to keep it soft for 2 weeks. It wasn't supposed to be soft. It was supposed to be alive. And yes, some people took it too far. There were sourdough fanatics who insisted commercial yeast was cheating, who woke up at 3 a.m. to do a stretch and fold, who refused to refrigerate their dough on the grounds that cold temps inhibit the yeast's emotional expression. No, really. That was a tweet. Fringe sourdough culture included starter tattoos, fermentation-themed baby names, and even one man who claimed his starter was linked to lunar cycles and ancestral energies. Was it dough? Was it a seance? Who's to say? Still, sourdough offered something real. After centuries of cheap fluff, of powdered bones and factory slices, of nutrition labels and additives, with 15 syllables, sourdough felt earned. It made you slow down, smell, feel, fail, try again. It made you bake like someone who remembered. So as you stare at your bubbly jar on the counter, gently rising, smelling faintly of apple cider and basement, know this: you're not just making bread, you're reconnecting with millennia of people who also forgot to clean their starter jar. And next, we're leaving the sourdough temple and heading around the globe. Because bread isn't just risen and round, it's flat, folded, fermented, and fried. And some of the best loaves were never loaves at all. At this point in your journey, you've stared deep into the crumb of crusty, risen loaves. You've seen industrial fluff and sacred discs. But now it's time to meet bread that didn't rise, or at least didn't need to. Welcome to the global world of flatbreads, the original fast food, street food, soul food, and survival food, all rolled into one. Because let's be real, not everyone wanted a dome-shaped sourdough. Sometimes you just needed dough, a fire, and a surface to slap it on. Let's start in India, home to a whole dictionary's worth of flatbreads. There's chapati, made with whole wheat flour, atta, rolled thin and cooked directly on a hot tower until it puffs like a balloon. There's roti, which overlaps with chapati, but varies regionally. And then, of course, naan, yeasted, enriched with yogurt or milk, and baked inside a blazing hot tandoor, sticking to the walls like edible wallpaper. You tear it with your hands, drag it through sauces, and forget forks exist. Perfect. Mainstream historical fact. The tandoor oven dates back thousands of years, with origins in the Indus Valley civilization. Archaeologists have found ancient clay ovens and charred bread remnants, suggesting people were baking naan-like bread while wearing what was probably an excellent linen wrap. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, you meet pitta, soft-pocketed and brilliant in its simplicity. When pitta hits the heat, steam inflates it into a pocket. Cut it open, and you've got the original sandwich. Stuff it with anything: lamb, pickles, hummus, or just anxiety and olive oil. Then there's lavash, the paper-thin Armenian flatbread, baked against the sides of a clay oven. It's so thin it can double as a tablecloth, yet so durable it's often dried into crisp sheets and stored for months. Need a plate? Grab some lavash. Need a napkin? Also lavash. Need a comforting carbohydrate hug? Yep, lavash again. Travel further, and you'll hit injera, the fermented spongy flatbread of Ethiopia and Eritrea, made from teff, a tiny ancient grain rich in iron. Injera is a culinary plate, utensil and flavor bomb, all at once. You eat with your hands, using pieces of injera to scoop up stews like doro wat, and the base layer, the one that soaks in all the sauces, is called the mother injera. It's sacred, it's the best bite, and yes, everyone knows it. Fringe tidbit. Injera isn't just about taste, it's also about hospitality. In some Ethiopian homes, the way injera is folded or presented signals status, respect, or occasion. There's an entire etiquette baked right in. Bread as language. Now swing west to Mexico, and you meet the mighty tortilla, arguably the most influential flatbread in the Americas, made from corn, maize, that's been nixtamalized, a process involving limb water that unlocks niacin and transforms flavor. Tortillas are more than food. Their heritage, their foundation. They're the base for tacos, enchiladas, quesadillas, chilaquiles, tostadas, basically every great thing ever invented at 2 a.m. And yes, there are flour tortillas too. Softer, larger, and more common in northern Mexico and the American Southwest. Made with lard or shortening, they roll better for burritos and other glorious edible tubes. Fringe historical fact: during the Mexican Revolution, women known as soldaderas followed soldiers into battle, cooking tortillas on hot rocks or shields. Bread as battlefield fuel. Head north and you'll hit fry bread, a complex, controversial dish with a painful origin, created by Native Americans during forced relocation, when traditional food sources were taken and they were issued flour, lard, and salt. Fry bread was born out of necessity. It's puffy, chewy, and fried golden. Delicious? Yes. But for many indigenous communities, it's also a symbol of loss, adaptation, and resistance. Bread that remembers. Flatbread exists everywhere. In Iran, taftan. In Turkey, yufka. In Greece, lagana. In Georgia, khachapuri, which technically rises but is so indulgent with its bubbling cheese and egg center, it deserves an honorary mention. In China, bing. Flaky, pan-fried discs that can be sweet or savory, stuffed or plain. In Scandinavia, knekkebrod, a crisp bread, so dry it can outlast your will to cook. In North Africa, mesemen, a laminated, griddled flatbread that flakes like a pastry but folds like a dream. These breads don't need yeast, or time, or a starter with a nickname. They're often mixed, rolled, cooked, and eaten within the hour. They're fast, adaptable, and often made on the go. A flat rock, a metal sheet, a fire pit. Done. And they're communal. You rarely eat flatbread alone. It's passed around, shared, torn, dipped, folded, used to mop up dinner or scoop a bite for someone else. You don't slice it, you break it, you eat together. And yet, despite being ancient, these breads feel modern. Street food vendors around the world build entire menus on flatbreads, wraps, pockets, pizzas. Yes, pizza is a flatbread technically. Born in Naples, raised in New York, rebranded globally, it started as food for the poor, cheap, fast, and folded. Now it's in Michelin-starred restaurants and your freezer. Flatbread is fluid. It crosses cultures. It changes shape. It carries everything, from royalty's feast to rebellion's rations. It's the democratic dough. Mainstream fact. Some flatbreads, like Finnish riska, are baked with mashed potatoes instead of flour. Others, like Norwegian lefse, are so thin you can read through them. And most were never meant to last. You bake, you eat, you repeat. And maybe that's the beauty of it. Not all bread wants to be preserved, or sliced, or sold. Some just wants to be eaten hot, torn with laughter, and remembered by touch. So as we roll through history, remember the breads that didn't rise, the ones that flattened themselves to feed you faster, the ones shaped by hand and fire, not factory mold. But bread isn't just food or form, it's power, it's protest, it's a tool, and sometimes it's the thing you throw when everything else falls apart. Next up, how bread became a symbol of riots, revolutions, and religious rituals. The loaf, the myth, the weapon, bread. So soft, so simple, so throwable, yes. Bread has fed empires and whispered prayers, but it's also been launched across barricades, burned in effigy, and wielded as a weapon of dissent. Because when a society breaks down, the people don't reach for pitchforks first. They reach for the loaf. Let's rewind to 18th century France, the gold standard of bread-based protest. In pre-revolutionary Paris, bread wasn't a side dish, it was life itself. The average working-class French person consumed nearly 2 pounds of bread per day, and that wasn't brioche or croissants, either. It was rough country bread, bought daily from local bakers, your entire diet. Bread and hope. So when the price of flour skyrocketed in the 1770s and 1780s, the consequences were immediate and visceral. Families couldn't eat. People lined up for hours only to be told the bakery had run out. Children starved. Bakers were mobbed. Some shops were looted. Others simply shut their doors and prayed. Then someone, not Marie Antoinette, despite the legend, suggested that if the people had no bread, they should eat cake. Whether she said it or not, the phrase became a symbol of elite cluelessness. A line in the sand, a rallying cry. Mainstream historical fact. One of the earliest major events of the French Revolution, the Women's March on Versailles in 1789, was driven in large part by bread shortages. Thousands of women marched from Paris to the royal palace, shouting for grain and justice. They demanded not just political change, but literal loaves. And they got them, kind of, but also a revolution. France isn't unique in this. In fact, bread riots are scattered all over history like sesame seeds on a crust. In Tsarist Russia, bread lines were long, rations small, and tempers shorter. By 1917, after years of war and economic collapse, women in Petrograd marched into the streets shouting bread, bread. Within days, their protests morphed into the February Revolution. The Tsar abdicated, and what began as a hunger protest over bread toppled an empire. Fringe tidbit. In the early years of the Soviet Union, bread rationing remained so harsh that loaf theft was a common and sometimes fatal crime. People would wait hours in line only to find the shelves empty. In Stalin's famines, a stolen crust could cost your life. And the symbolism of bread wasn't limited to revolutions. It was built into religion and politics too. Take the Eucharist in Christianity. Bread as body, broken and shared. The ritual of communion made bread more than food. It became divine metaphor. It was the miracle of sustenance, the centerpiece of faith, and also a reason to argue. Historians still argue whether early Christian sects split in part due to the type of bread used during the Eucharist. Unleavened in the West, leavened in the East. One symbolized humility, the other divine rising. Theological bread beefs were real and very heated. Meanwhile, in Islam, bread, khubz, is revered. It's haram to waste it. Many Muslim households have long practiced never throwing bread away, instead placing stale pieces out for birds or wrapping uneaten bread respectfully before disposal. Bread is considered a gift from God. You don't mess with it. But bread's political power kept rising. In 1977, Egypt saw massive food riots when President Sadat attempted to cut state bread subsidies under IMF pressure. Thousands poured into the streets, trains were stopped, fires lit, the army was deployed. Within days, the cuts were reversed. Bread subsidies stayed because if the people can't afford bread, you lose the people. Even in modern times, bread protests remain common in Venezuela, Tunisia, Sudan, Greece. When economies collapse, when inflation soars, when grain shipments stall, bread becomes the canary in the coal mine, or more accurately, the baguette in the bonfire. Fringe fact: in 2011, during the Arab Spring, the phrase Aish, Hurriya, Adala, Iktima Ya, bread, freedom, social justice, became a protest chant across Egypt. The word Aish means both bread and life. In other words, no bread, no future. And sometimes, bread isn't just protest, it's punishment. In medieval Europe, adulterating bread, using fillers like chalk or sawdust, was a crime. Bakers caught cheating were publicly humiliated. Some were tied to posts and had their bad loaves nailed around their necks. Others were forced to give away bread for free, or worse, forbidden from baking at all. A truly medieval nightmare. Yet even as bread was fought over, burned, thrown, and criminalized, it was also a symbol of peace. In ancient rituals and modern peace treaties, breaking bread together remains one of humanity's most enduring signs of trust. Sharing a meal, especially bread, is an act of vulnerability, of welcome, of saying, you're not the enemy, you're the guest. It's why so many sacred meals across cultures include bread in some form. It's why diplomats toast. It's why war zones have bakeries that reopen the minute a ceasefire begins. Bread may start riots, but it also helps end them, because bread carries meaning. It's cheap, portable, easy to recognize. It feeds the body and stirs the soul. So when things go wrong, people don't protest with poetry. They demand the loaf. And next, we look at the loaves that didn't make it. The forgotten breads, the extinct grains, the mystery buns in archaeological ruins. Because even in silence, bread leaves crumbs. Bread has endured wars, riots, rituals, and reformations. But not every loaf made it out alive. Some vanished, quietly, forgotten by time, replaced by fluffier, trendier doughs. Others are remembered only by crumbs in ancient ovens, or cryptic mentions in old cookbooks that read more like sorcery than culinary instruction. Welcome to the bread graveyard, a place of lost loaves and extinct grains. Let's start with spelt. An ancient cousin of wheat, it once dominated European fields. High in protein, lower in gluten, beloved by Roman bakers and medieval peasants alike. But then modern wheat came along, yielding more, growing faster, shipping better, and spelt got shunted off to monasteries, hippie farms, and Instagram recipes about digestive ease. Same with einkorn, humanity's oldest cultivated wheat. It was the grain behind some of the earliest loaves in Mesopotamia and Anatolia, short, stubby, slightly nutty in flavor. Einkorn couldn't compete with modern wheat's elasticity and wasn't machine-friendly, so it faded from view. Archaeologists find traces of it in Bronze Age ovens, but you won't see it in your average supermarket bread aisle. Then there's black bread, not the hearty rye kind, but the mystery loaves mentioned in medieval texts, that seem to defy full identification. Some made with bean flour, fermented peas, or even ground nutshells during famine. Others were so tough, travelers supposedly used them as makeshift shoes when boots wore out. Were they exaggerating? Maybe. But medieval monks were not known for their sense of humor. Fringe tidbit. A 15th century manuscript from northern Germany describes a funeral tradition where small round soul breads were baked and left at graves, then later eaten by the poor. It was believed the bread helped carry the deceased soul into the afterlife. Historians still argue whether this was symbolic or just a creative form of recycling. You also get strange funeral buns in Saxon and Slavic cultures. Sweetened, braided loaves shaped like bones, doves, or open eyes. Some were eaten at wakes, others buried with the dead. A few even had initials stamped into the dough before baking. Part memorial, part meal, all weirdly forgotten. And what about the ritual loaves of ancient Greece? There were dozens, some offered to Demeter, goddess of grain, during festivals like Thesmophoria, others used in secret Eleusinian rites. Recipes? Lost. Shapes? Unknown. Taste? Your guess is as good as any olive farmer's. Or the mysterious black cakes of Tudor England, mentioned in records feared by some Puritans and described as sticky, dense, and possibly fermented. Were they dessert? Were they punishment? No one really knows. Some think they evolved into the dark fruitcakes of Victorian Christmases. Others suspect they were savory, spiced loaves used in political rituals or served during hangings. It's all a bit blurry. History doesn't always label the pantry. And then there are the trial breads, loaves baked by communities to test whether a new oven was properly blessed or cursed. These were often shaped strangely or baked with symbolic ingredients like fennel, ash or lard from a recently sacrificed animal. If the loaf rose, the oven was good. If it burned or collapsed, bad omen. Shut it down, or worse, exorcise it. Mainstream historical fact. In ancient Rome, new communal ovens were inaugurated with salted loaves, dedicated to the household gods. They were never eaten, just left to cool in peace. Offerings to the domestic spirit world. It's like blessing your microwave with a ceremonial hot pocket. And in parts of Eastern Europe, we find the nearly extinct Chelar ancestors braided loaves made for weddings, sometimes shaped like crowns, rings, or birds. They weren't just food, they were edible metaphors for commitment. The bride and groom would pull the loaf apart together, symbolizing shared labor, shared joy, and hopefully not shared indigestion. Some breads were lost to climate shifts. Drought wiped out certain ancient grains, and with them, the loaves they inspired. Others disappeared during colonization, banned or forgotten as imperial food cultures bulldozed local traditions. In parts of Africa, Asia, and the Americas, centuries-old baking techniques were replaced with imported flours, shapes, and rituals. Still others were victims of technology. The rise of factory flour meant certain grains couldn't be milled efficiently, so they vanished. Gone were the coarse, chewy barley loaves, the oddly bitter emmer breads, the rough peasant bakes that tasted like hard work and moss, all replaced by spongy uniformity. And of course, some just fell out of favor. Like panis quadratus, the iconic Roman loaf with its 8 scored wedges, immortalized in Pompeii, buried under ash, baked just moments before disaster. We can reconstruct it, we can admire it, but no one makes it like that anymore. Not really. Even the tools disappeared. The bread peel, the clay oven, the quernstone, they became museum pieces, historical curiosities. Ghosts of gluten passed, but the crumbs remain. In old cookbooks, dusty monastery records, cryptic archaeological reports, someone's scorched loaf on a fire-blackened hearth, a fossilized bite still caught in a Roman soldier's teeth. And today, a few bakers are reviving them, tracking down lost grains, reconstructing forgotten doughs, brewing wild yeast, baking with wood and smoke and prayer. Not because it's practical, but because it connects them to people who came before, who baked without timers or recipes or Instagram likes. Bread is memory, and sometimes memory needs flour. But we're not done yet. Next stop, outer space. Because yes, astronauts miss toast. So, we've kneaded through ancient kitchens, war-torn bakeries, and underground rituals. But now it's time to stare into the void of outer space, where bread is complicated. Because even at zero gravity, even with freeze-dried ice cream and vacuum-sealed borscht, humans still miss toast. But first, the big question. Can you eat bread in space? Short answer, not really. Or at least, not the kind you're used to. Let's back up. When the early astronauts, like those aboard NASA's Project Mercury in the 1960s, first blasted off Earth, they weren't packing ham sandwiches. They were drinking their meals through aluminum tubes, like toothpaste, with vitamins, no crumbs, no mess, just high-protein goo. But eventually, astronauts wanted real food, or something close to it, so NASA tried sending up various solid foods, cubes, sticks, rehydratable pouches. And yes, in 1965, two Gemini 3 astronauts smuggled a corned beef sandwich into orbit. As a prank, it did not go well. As soon as they unwrapped it, crumbs floated everywhere. In zero gravity, a single breadcrumb doesn't fall. It drifts into equipment, into eyes, into air filters. A floating rye flake might seem harmless until it clogs a $10 million oxygen scrubber. Mainstream historical fact. After the Gemini 3 incident, bread was banned on American spacecraft. It wasn't about health or nutrition, it was the mess. Every loose particle became a potential threat. NASA was not amused. So what did astronauts eat instead? Enter the tortilla. Yes, flatbread saved spaceflight. Unlike bread, tortillas don't crumb. They fold, they seal, they stick to themselves. In the 1980s, NASA began testing them, and by the time of the Space Shuttle missions, tortillas had replaced bread almost entirely. Breakfast burritos, space wraps, peanut butter and honey, tortillas, all very real. Fringe tidbit. Astronauts love tortillas so much, they once ran out mid-mission and had to ration them like gold. One astronaut called them the most versatile food in orbit. Another said, "The day we got resupplied with tortillas was the best day of the mission." But what about bread lovers? Surely someone's tried. Oh yes, in 2008, a German astronaut took pumpernickel to the ISS, dense, crumb-free and vacuum-sealed in a tin. It worked okay, chewy, moist, kind of like edible clay. Other space agencies have tried compact loaves, freeze-dried rolls, and even crustless cubes designed to dissolve without shedding crumbs. Results have been mixed. Let's just say no one's opening a Parisian bakery in orbit. Still, the emotional pull of bread in space is strong. Earth food, Earth memories, the smell of baking, the crunch of crust, the warmth in your hands. That's hard to replicate when your kitchen is a steel tube the size of a minivan, flying 17,500 miles per hour. Which is why, in recent years, scientists have started asking the unthinkable. Can we bake bread in space? It's a weird challenge. You can't use an open flame. There's no gravity, heat doesn't rise, dough doesn't fall, and if anything spills, it floats. But in 2018, a German team, part of the Baking Space Initiative, yes, that's a real name, began testing zero-gravity baking tech. They designed a sealed oven for the ISS. The idea: use controlled heat and air circulation to bake a mini loaf without crumbs, smoke, or accidental fireballs. Their goal: the smell of freshly baked bread in orbit. Because yes, smell is another issue in space. Your sinuses swell from the pressure, so food tastes dull. Hot sauce, extremely popular on the ISS. But fresh bread, that aroma could change everything. It's not just food, it's mental health. And then there's the big picture: colonies on Mars. If we ever plan to live off-world, we'll need more than vacuum-sealed mush. We'll need agriculture. Grain, ovens, bread. NASA and ESA are studying how to grow wheat in lunar greenhouses, how to use Martian soil, filtered and treated, and how to sustain yeast cultures over years. It's not just sci-fi, it's prep work. Because no one wants to start a new world without toast. Fringe detail: some scientists are experimenting with insect flour and algae-based doughs for space baking. Sustainable. High protein, mildly horrifying. But hey, if it rises, it rises. And yes, sourdough has entered the chat. In 2020, a Canadian baker sent a sample of sourdough starter to the edge of space, strapped to a balloon at 35,000 meters. It survived. It frothed. It came back stronger. Astronauts haven't baked with it yet, but someone out there is going to bake galactic sourdough with Martian wheat and a starter named Neil Doughstrong. Because wherever humans go, bread follows. Cave? Loaf? Monastery? Loaf? War zone? Loaf? Space station? Orbiting Earth at 5 miles per second? Still loaf. Why? Because it's not just food, it's home, it's ritual, it's survival. It's the first thing we miss when we're light years from where we started. Next, the philosophy of bread. Why it matters, why it keeps coming back, why you're still thinking about it now, as the night grows quiet and your eyes grow heavy. By now, you've wandered from ancient fields to lunar labs, trailing flower dust across empires, ovens, and orbit. So let's ask something deceptively simple. Why bread? Why has this one food, so basic, so humble, anchored itself in almost every culture, every century, every struggle and celebration? Because bread isn't just sustenance, it's a philosophy. Start with the ingredients. Flour, water, salt. That's it. Just 3 things. No more complex than a puddle. But when you combine them, you don't just get dough, you get potential. A sticky, sleeping thing waiting to become more. Something that changes with time, warmth, and care. Bread is the algebra of patience. You can't force it, can't hack it. It demands respect, rhythm, and a weirdly intimate relationship with timing. Wait too long. Overproved. Rush it. Flat. Underbaked. Sad and gummy. Overbaked. A brick. It's the most emotionally sensitive food in your kitchen, and yet, somehow, also the most forgiving. Try again tomorrow. It'll still rise. Mainstream historical fact. Some of the earliest written laws, like the Code of Hammurabi from ancient Babylon, regulated bread, not gold, not silk, bread. The daily loaf was important enough to be legally protected. Bakers had to sell at set prices. They could be punished for cheating on weight or ingredients. Bread was infrastructure. That matters. Because bread isn't just personal, it's communal. It connects you to the people who made your flour, to the farmers who harvested your grain, to the air that fed your yeast. Even now, every slice you eat is a tiny chain of relationships, most invisible, but deeply real. When you break bread with someone, you aren't just sharing food, you're sharing a moment of trust. It's primal. It says we're not fighting, we're not fleeing, we're staying together and feeding ourselves, as humans have done since before fire was fully understood. There's a reason so many traditions place bread at the center of ritual, not just because it fills you, but because it grounds you. Jewish kollel on Shabbat, communion wafers in Christian liturgy, Ibit bread shared after Ramadan, loaves left on graves in Slavic funerals, Ban Ching at Vietnamese New Year, even the burnt offerings of Mesopotamian temples. Bread becomes a bridge from this world to the next, from the body to the soul. Fringe tidbit. There are Buddhist temples in Japan that bake rice bread as a form of mindful meditation. Each fold and press is done in silence, not as a task, but as a practice. A dough-based version of prayer. And you feel it, don't you? That sense of ritual when you bake it yourself. The weighing, the mixing, the stretching and folding. The smell as it bakes, the anticipation as it cools. You know it could have gone wrong, but it didn't. And now it's there, warm and golden, and you made it. That's more than baking. That's transformation. Even the language proves it. Breadwinner. Earning your daily bread. Breaking bread. The best thing since sliced bread. Bread is woven into how we describe safety, success, even genius. It's shorthand for comfort, for dignity, for making it through the day. And yet, it's fragile. Entire empires have risen and fallen on the strength of their grain supply. A bad harvest, a riot, a blockade, famine, a trade deal gone wrong, starvation. Bread is history's pressure gauge. Its presence means calm, its absence means collapse. And this makes it philosophical, because bread forces you to confront time, from planting the seed to harvesting, milling, mixing, rising, and baking. It stretches across days, seasons, years. You can't rush it. You can't cheat it. You can only participate in it. In a world full of fast everything, emails, dopamine hits, doorbell pizza, bread remains stubbornly analog. And that slowness, that's the point. It reminds you you're alive, that your hands matter, that nature still does half the work if you just wait. And people are waking up to this. Again, artisan bakeries are packed. Sourdough classes are booked out. Kids are learning to mix dough with grandparents. Baking is therapy. Crumb is identity. Instagram may love the aesthetics, but it's the ritual that brings people back. Historians still argue, whether bread truly shaped civilization, or if civilization simply grew around bread. But the evidence is there. Wheat before walls, grains before kings, ovens before organized armies. Once we stopped wandering and started planting, bread became the anchor. It's the one food that feels universal. Maybe not always the same shape, or grain, or flavor, but always present. Always shared. Always more than food. So if you ever feel small, or lost, or unsteady, bake bread, tear it, share it. Feel how it grounds you, stretches you, softens you. It won't fix everything, but it reminds you that some things, warmth, labor, time, are still good. Next, we'll trace that final stretch. How bread lives today. From toaster aisle to artisan counter. From suburban lunchbox to Michelin plate. And how the oldest food on earth just keeps coming back. Today, bread is everywhere and nowhere. It fills entire supermarket aisles. It's wrapped in plastic. It's discounted in bulk. It's gluten-free, high-fiber, no crust, sprouted, organic, artisanal, keto alternative, and shaped like a teddy bear for kids who scream when their sandwich looks too bread-like. But here's the thing. Bread survived modernity. It didn't just limp into the 21st century, it shape-shifted, rebranded, made itself disposable, and then sacred again. It's a paradox in a paper bag. Let's start with the supermarket loaf. These are the soft, unnaturally springy slices that never go stale and never go bad. They just fade into staleness like a ghost slowly losing interest in haunting you. They're usually made with high-speed industrial mixers, bleached flour, added sugar, stabilizers, preservatives, and about 7 ingredients whose names sound like members of a niche jazz band. Calcium proponate, mono and diglycerides, azodicarbonamide. Yes, that last one is also used in yoga mats. No, you don't want to think about that at breakfast. Mainstream historical fact. The very first mechanical bread slicer was introduced in 1928. It was advertised as the greatest forward step in baking since bread was wrapped. That's where we get the expression, the best thing since sliced bread. It wasn't just about convenience, it was about control, uniformity, and the rise of mass food culture. By the mid-20th century, sliced white bread symbolized modern life. Clean, predictable, American, and eventually, boring. Cue the counter-movement, the artisan revival. Around the 1970s and 80s, bakers often trained in Europe or inspired by old-world methods began pushing back. They brought back stone mills, wild yeast, long fermentation, hand shaping. Suddenly, crust was allowed to be dark. Holes in the crumb weren't a mistake, they were art, and it grew. By the 2000s, artisan bread became a category. Supermarkets offered rustic loaves that came half-baked and finished in store. Just for the smell, bread with burnt bottoms was considered desirable. Words like boule, levain, and hydration ratio became small talk at brunch. Even fast food got the memo. Chains like Panera and Pret pretended to be bakeries. Subway advertised its fresh-baked bread, which later turned out awkwardly to contain so much sugar that Ireland legally ruled it wasn't bread at all. Fringe tidbit. In 2020, during peak pandemic lockdown, Google searches for sourdough starter spiked 7,000%. Yeast was sold out in stores. People named their starters. Social feeds filled with crusty loaves like baby photo albums. Bread was back, and this time, it had a personality. But beyond trends, bread adapted to new diets. There's gluten-free bread made from rice flour, almond flour, tapioca starch, and unicorn dust. Some of it's delicious. Some of it has the mouthfeel of packing foam. But it matters, because people want bread, even if they can't tolerate wheat. They want the ritual. The slice, the smell, that moment where the toaster pops, and you feel slightly more in control of your day. There's keto bread, low-carb, high-fat, often made with egg whites and psyllium husk. It's chewy, dense, sometimes oddly purple. But again, people want breadness, even if it's only spiritually similar. There's protein bread, sprouted grain bread, zero sugar bread, seeded Nordic crisp bread that could double as roofing tile. There's bread made from cauliflower, or cloud, or crushed nuts and lies. But the point is, the form remains. People are still chasing that primal joy of flour and fire, even if they replace the flour and change the fire to an air fryer. And at the high end, bread became luxury. You'll find sourdough loaves selling for 12 ounces at farmers markets, infused with rosemary, olives, activated charcoal, squid ink. Michelin-starred restaurants serve bread courses with cultured butter, whipped goat's cheese, or 3 kinds of salt. Your waiter may now explain the flour's terroir, the way a sommelier describes wine. There's even bread art, loaves painted with herbs, scored into floral patterns or shaped like animals. Bakers on Instagram now compete for crust aesthetics, with loaves so beautiful you feel guilty slicing them. They're the edible version of bonsai tree. Meanwhile, in school lunches across suburbia, the humble sandwich lives on. Peanut butter and jelly, ham and cheese, turkey on wheat, crusts cut off for picky eaters, bread as background music, quiet, reliable, comforting, and yet somehow revered. Bread is now political, ethical, philosophical. Who baked your bread? Is your flour regenerative? Is your starter wild or domesticated? These aren't questions from a bakery, they're identity quizzes. Bread has become a signifier, a vibe, a choice, and it's international. Korean milk bread, Japanese shokupan, French baguettes, Algerian korbs, Ethiopian dabo, Brazilian pão de queijo. Bread doesn't care about borders. It just needs warmth, time, and someone willing to wait. Historians still argue whether we're entering a bread renaissance, or just circling back to the beginning. But that's the thing about bread. It's a loop. It rises, falls, rests, and returns. And no matter what shape it takes, bread will always be there. In crisis, in celebration, in space, in childhood lunchboxes, in sacred temples, in plastic bags on rainy grocery runs. In someone's hands right now, somewhere in the world, scoring a loaf, waiting for that first whiff of golden crust. Next, we'll bring it all home. How to recognize what bread means now that we've followed it from ashes to orbit. Time to cool the crust and let the story rest. So now you're here, on the final stretch of the story, trailing flour across 5,000 years of history. By now, you've seen bread rise and collapse. You've watched it fuel pharaohs, spark revolutions, and orbit the earth in tortilla form. It's been blessed, banned, blamed, and baked. And yet, even after all that, the loaf just keeps showing up. But what does bread mean, really? It means whatever a society needs it to mean. To some, bread is survival. To others, it's comfort. For a few, it's art. And for many, it's memory. A thing that ties them to childhood, to culture, to kitchen rituals, and grandparents who measured flour with their hands, not cups. You can almost hear the stories that get baked into every loaf. The Sunday mornings, the holiday tables, the burnt edges, the smell so strong it reached upstairs before you were awake. Even the mistakes matter, the dense loaves, the collapsed middles, the ones that had to be scraped out of the pan with existential dread. They all tell you something about where you were, who you were, what you needed. Fringe tidbit. In some regions of Portugal, people believe bread can hear you, so if you drop it, you're supposed to kiss it and say sorry. It's a superstition, sure, but also a gentle kind of reverence. Bread, treated not as a thing, but a witness. Mainstream historical fact. Even in our most advanced societies during disasters, floods, blackouts, blizzards, the first thing to vanish from store shelves is bread. Not caviar, not chips, bread. Because deep down, we know that if there's bread, there's still a thread of normalcy. That's why so many cultures keep emergency loaves. Hardtack, pilot bread, dry biscuits sealed in tins. They're awful. They last forever. They exist to remind you, this is what you eat when all else fails. Bread as bunker. But most of us don't want bread to just survive. We want it to connect. To the soil, to each other, to the past. We bake because we want to feel a little more human, a little more useful, a little more present in a world that keeps asking for speed. Think about it. In an age where artificial intelligence can write poems and robots can flip burgers, there's something defiant about standing in your kitchen, elbow deep in dough, shaping something that can't be rushed, that won't go viral, that exists for one reason only: to be shared. And yet, despite how sacred bread can be, it's also just funny, soft when you want it crunchy, crunchy when you want it soft, always slightly off-center in the toaster, always leaving crumbs in your keyboard, forever betraying you with just one slice too many. And yet, you forgive it. Bread's magic is that it's never perfect, but it's always enough. It doesn't care if you pronounce focaccia correctly. It doesn't care if your sourdough starter has a name. It doesn't mind if you use a bread machine, or a cast iron pan, or the same toaster oven you've had since university. It just rises, or it doesn't. And then you try again, and you always will. Historians still argue whether bread created civilization or just followed it around, like a loyal dog waiting for crumbs. Either way, it's still here, on every table, in every city, in every story we quietly pass on without writing anything down. And that's the final twist. Bread isn't just history you can eat, it's history that remembers you back. It holds on to fingerprints and habits and hopes. It absorbs everything you give it, your time, your energy, your heat. It becomes the sum of your patience and flour. That's a strange kind of immortality, isn't it? A loaf that says, you were here, and you fed someone, and so, tomorrow, or the next day, or the next year, when you open a bag of flour and run your hand through it, maybe you'll pause, maybe you'll remember where it all started, maybe you'll think of Mesopotamian bakers, or lunar tortillas, or your grandmother's cracked measuring cup. Or maybe, just maybe, you'll think of this. That bread so ordinary, so boring, so quietly sacred, has never once stopped showing up for us. Not when we were ancient, not when we were starving, not when we were lonely, not even when we launched ourselves into the stars. Next, we wrap the journey. The final two sections bring you full circle, through sleepiness, stillness, and the soft whisper of cooling loaves. By now the flour's settled, the ovens have cooled, and the world of bread, once bustling with millstones and markets, priests and peasants, astronauts and algorithms, feels quieter. You've walked the full timeline from ash cakes to AI-toasted gluten-free oat slabs, but as the crust cracks and the night deepens, let's pause on the quietest truth of all. Bread is not about drama, it's about repetition. It's the ultimate cycle. Mix, rise, shape, bake, eat. And then, again, and again, and again. There's a kind of holiness in that loop. It doesn't ask for innovation, it asks for attention. No one invents a new way to knead dough every week. No one rebrands the smell of rising yeast. Bread is one of the few human rituals that remains untouched by trend cycles. Even when the ingredients change, or the bakers change, or the planet changes, the rhythm remains. Mainstream historical fact. Across thousands of years, the method of bread making has barely shifted. Sure, machines got faster, ovens got cleaner, and flour got whiter. But if you put a 21st century baker beside an ancient Egyptian one, they'd still recognize each other's hands. That mix of flour on skin, the gentle pressure of the fold, the moment when you know it's ready. Some things don't need translation. And this right here is where bread's secret power lies. It's anchoring. You don't need a recipe to understand what it's doing. You can watch dough rise and feel something inside you slow down, match its pace. You don't kneel before it, but you wait. And that waiting, half sacred, half sleepy, is one of the few human experiences that hasn't been monetized or sped up. Fringe tidbit. In rural Italy, some older women still whisper small blessings over their dough before shaping it. Not because they think it will rise better, but because their mothers did. A ritual without audience, a gesture for the loaf, and maybe for the soul too. And the bread doesn't care what mood you're in. It doesn't mind if you're tired, or angry, or unsure. It just accepts your effort, absorbs your warmth, and becomes something more than the sum of its parts. A lesson, maybe. In a world of glowing screens and endless tabs, bread teaches containment, that it's okay to make something small, something humble, something finite. And yet it also teaches abundance, because every loaf, even the most misshapen, even the one that stuck to the pan or burned just slightly too much, can still be shared, broken into pieces, handed out, left in baskets, offered in silence, eaten with fingers and laughter and tea. Bread doesn't demand an occasion, it creates one. You know this instinctively, that sense of sudden warmth when someone hands you toast, the way a crusty baguette on a table makes even soup feel like an event, the strange relief of butter melting on something solid after a long day. These are not meals, these are moments, and bread is full of them. Historians still argue whether we've romanticized bread too much, whether it's really so central, or whether it's just what we notice when everything else fades. But that's kind of the point, isn't it? When the noise dims, and the plates clear, and the day ends, there's often a little bread left, just sitting there, waiting, and somehow, it still matters. So tonight, let that be your final thought before sleep. That something so old, so simple, so crumby, could be the quietest, most patient reminder of your place in the world. Next, we slow it all down. The last section, the wind down, the whisper, the cool crust at the end of a warm, long loaf. So now, the story rests. No more rising. No more burning ovens or sourdough wars or lunar tortillas. Just the quiet hum of memory and the faint, toasty echo of everything bread has been. You've walked it all through ash and altar, riot and ritual, bakery and battlefield, and now it's time to let it go, because bread doesn't demand a grand finale. It doesn't need a hero's arc. It just exists, softly, on a table, wrapped in cloth, eaten, without fanfare. And maybe that's the most remarkable thing of all. You probably don't remember your first bite of bread. No one does. That's how constant it is. It's just there, from the beginning, waiting. The thick crust your grandparents cut, the sandwich you barely tasted between school bells, the loaf someone left out after a party, a crumb on the counter, a smell in the hall, a heel no one wanted, but you took anyway. Even now, some oven somewhere is cooling, some bakery's shutting off its lights. A starter is sleeping in the back of a fridge. A packet of yeast is waiting, quietly, for a reason to matter again. Bread isn't loud. It doesn't boast. It just shows up. When you're tired, when you're broke, when you're celebrating, when there's nothing left in the fridge but a crust and some butter, and somehow that's enough. And even if you forget this entire story tomorrow, you'll remember the warmth, the rise, the rhythm, because this wasn't just a history lesson. It was a recipe, folded into you without needing instructions. So the next time you break a piece off, no matter where you are in the world, no matter what kind of day it's been, just remember, you're part of the oldest ritual in human history. Quiet, gentle, endless. And that's enough. Now slow your breathing, loosen your jaw. Feel the weight of the night settle like flour on a counter. There's nothing more to do. The oven's off. The story's told. The loaf is cool. Word count. Wind down. 300 words. Let it all fade now. The flour dust. The clatter of wooden spoons. The soft stretch of dough between your fingers. Let it drift, like steam rising from a fresh loaf. Visible for only a second. Then gone. The noise of the day. It doesn't belong here. The worries, they can rest too. Right now, all you need is stillness. Feel your body, slow to match the rhythm of bread. Steady, quiet, patient, a gentle inhale, a softer exhale, like dough expanding in the dark. No effort, no hurry. Picture a quiet kitchen. A candle flickers, a crust cools. Outside the world softens. Inside everything smells warm, safe, familiar. You've done enough today. You've earned your peace. Let your thoughts rise, like bubbles in dough, and float gently away. Let your muscles rest, like a loaf left untouched, perfect in its stillness. No need to remember all the facts. No need to keep every crumb. Just hold on to the feeling, the calm that lives in simple things, the beauty of repetition, the comfort of something baked, shared, and real. So now, dim the lights, ease your weight into the mattress, and let the last crust of consciousness dissolve. The story's done. The loaf is whole. You are warm and full and still.